Rather all of you tell me to record than none of you. Okay, so if 1 acre has 43,560 square feet, let's say you are working a problem, and let's say, you got 4 answer choices. Everything is multiple choice. Yes. And sometimes you can look at the answers, especially with math. Sometimes you can look at the answers and maybe rule one choice out before you ever pick up a calculator. So what do I mean by this? For example, let's just say that you do the math, you come up with it, you come up with a solution, and you get, I don't know, making numbers up, 65,000 square feet. Give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Is that more than or less than 1 acre? 65,000 square feet. That's going to be more than 1 acre, right? Because 1 acre is 43,560 square feet. So you have more than 43,560 square feet. You have more than an acre. So couldn't you rule out an answer choice that is 1 acre or less? If one of the options were, 0.8 of an acre or something, couldn't you rule that one out? You guys see how we can use this number to help us gauge? Again, what if you're given it and it's, again, I'm just kind of making stuff up, 30,000 square feet, more than or less than 1 acre. That's going to now be less than. So if one of your answer choices is 3 acres, you can rule that out. So I want you guys to start really looking at the math, not just reading the problem, picking a calculator as fast as you possibly can. Just look at it and look at some of the answer choices. Remember the other day when we were calculating commission and we did the T-bar 2 different ways? We multiplied and then divide, and when we divided, we got a commission of $3 million on a $100,000 purchase price. Couldn't you roll that out before ever picking up a calculator? Right. So sometimes and I don't think that's true with just math. I think a lot of these problems, there's almost always, one answer that's so wrong, you can rule it out early, right? You just know there's nothing right about that answer. And so now you had a 25% chance of getting it right. You rule one out. Now you got a 33% chance of getting it right. What do y'all want to go to Vegas on? 25% odds or 33% odds? I'd rather go to Vegas on 33, right? So just sometimes looking at the answers can help you guys rule something out, increase your chances. Even if you have to guess, you still got a better chance of getting it right. So what are we going to do with this number? Well, we need to know how to convert this number from square feet to acres and from acres to square feet. So kind of our formula, when you multiply, you're converting acres to square feet. You're taking the number of acres times 43,560. If you are converting square feet to acres, then you're going to divide. You're going to take the square feet and divide it by 43,560. And that's going to give you however many acres. Do I have any newfound T-bar fans out there? Have I converted anybody yet? Have I gotten some of you? Some of you hands going up? Good, good. I have figured out how to take the T-bar, tweak it just a little bit, and make what we're saying here work. So instead of the part on top, we're going to put square feet. Instead of the whole, we're going to put acres. And then instead of the rate, we're going to put our magic number of 43,560. So you guys have choices. We either remember when you're going from acres to square feet, you multiply. When you're going from square feet to acres, you divide, or you use the T-bar as your formula. Square feet on top. Again, I'm tweaking it just a bit. Good morning. I'm tweaking it just a bit, but it works. So if you get the T-bar, I suggest this. If you haven't got it yet, don't worry. I'll get you. I'll convert you before it's over. That's my personal goal each class, is to have you guys leaving, if nothing else, as T-bar fans. Everybody have this jotted down? One or the other or both? You think we're going to do some practice next? Of course we are. How much fun would it be for you not to pick up the calculator, right? Everybody good? Everybody have this written down? Okay. Tell me in a private chat, you should still have your private chat set. How many acres are in 21,780 square feet? How many acres? Give you about 30 more seconds. Okay. So how many acres are in 21,780? We'll do for my T-bar fans first. Instead of rate or percent, we're going to put our magic number, 43,560. I'm solving for X, which is my acres. And I have 21,780 square feet. The back fourth line, or east-west line, means divide. So you take 21,780, divide it by 43,560, and we get half an acre. Is 21,780 more than or less than 43,560? It is less than, right? So your number has got to be less than an acre. Everybody with me? See how we can look at that number and really just analyze it before we ever pick up our calculator. If I haven't converted you into a T-bar fan yet, then you just take your calculator, 21,780, divide it by 43,560, and you get half of an acre. Let's try it again. Now in a private chat, tell me how many square feet are in 4 acres. How many square feet are in 4 acres? Is that a question? Give about 15 more seconds. So how many square feet in 4 acres? Am I going to have more than or less than 43,560? My answer should be more than, right? Because 4 acres is more than 1. So I know that. I know my magic number, 43,560. This time I know I have 4 acres. And now I'm solving for X, which is my square feet. So 4 times 43,560 is 174,250 square feet. How many square feet are in 4 acres? 174,240. Again, my non-T-bar fans. Yet, if you just take 4 times 43,560, you get 174,240 acres. I'm telling you guys, you use this number every day in real estate. Every single day in real estate. Maybe not every day. Most days. You get to take a day off every once in a while. So on your day off, you may not have to use this number. Okay, questions? 43,560. 43,560. 43,560. Good. Yeah, so that's, thank you. So instead, we said the rate or percent always goes in the bottom right. Well, we don't have a rate or percent, and that's why we're just kind of tweaking it, just a hair. So I don't have a rate or percent. So instead of rate or percent always going in the bottom right, now we're going to use our 43,560. You guys think they're going to give you 43,560 on your test? No. So know that number. There's a reason why I repeat myself 20 times. So know that number, okay? Little typo. All right, so where this is leading us is into calculating various shapes. So here's the good news. We're only dealing with squares and rectangles. We may possibly see a problem dealing with triangles. We're not going to worry about, circles and hexagons and octagons and all those funny shapes. So this is the good news. We're going to keep this simple. And when we're looking at squares and rectangles, let's just talk about squares and rectangles first. My formula tells me length times width equals square foot. Length times width. That's your formula. How do we solve for square foot? Length times width equals square foot. My pre-algebra fans on the call, you may recognize this as A times B equals C. You guys remember that? Is that a blast from your past? A times B equals C. That's all we're doing here. So there's a couple different ways that we can use this formula, and it depends on the verbiage. Length times width, if we're talking about length times width, we might be looking for the square foot of a kitchen or a living room or a dining room. When you're measuring maybe an individual room, you may need to know length times width equals square foot. We're going to talk all about measuring in Unit 8. There's some rules and guidelines that go with measuring. So we will talk about that in Unit 8. Hang tight. The other way we may use this formula is when we're measuring a tract of land. And the formula is the same. The idea is the same. It's just the verbiage is a little bit different. When you're measuring a tract of land, we don't call it length. We call it front foot. And when you're measuring land, we don't call it width. We call it depth. Front foot times depth equals the square foot of that lot. So it may give you the lot dimensions, the front foot, the depth. You find the square feet, and the problem may ask you how many acres. So when you're looking at land, usually they're going to give you one and ask you to convert it. They're going to give you acres and convert it to square feet, or give you the square feet and convert it to acres. When we're talking about land, let's pretend that this is our lot and there's a road. Excuse my drawing skills. So there's the lot and here's the road. The front foot is the portion of the property that runs parallel to the road. The front foot is the portion of the property that runs parallel to the road. The depth, if you were to stand on the corner of this lot with your back to the road, the depth is how deep is it? How far back does it go? So the front foot is what runs parallel to the road. The depth is how deep is it? How far back does it go? We're going to look at some examples in just a second. Everybody good so far? Front foot is the length. The length and the front foot are, when you're given a word problem and you see the dimensions, the front foot and the length are the first dimensions given. So for example, the problem might tell you that this lot is 100 by 150. It just gave you the formula, didn't it? How do you find square feet? You take 100 times 150, and that'll give you the square feet of that lot. The 100 is the front foot or the length. The 150 is the depth or the width. Can I erase what I have so far in the pink? Everybody with me so far? Okay. T-bar fans. Guess what? We can use length or front foot times width or depth to give us the square foot. I think when the problem asks you for square foot, it's easy just to multiply. I think in this case where the T-bar comes into handy is when it gives you the length and the square foot and it asks you for the width. So now we have to divide something. And I think the T-bar helps us know what to divide and when. Again, A times B equals C. That's all we're saying here. So we can use the T-bar, length or front foot. Again, tweaking the T-bar just a bit. Width or depth, square feet still goes on top. We did put square feet on top for acres too, right? So we can just remember when we're dealing with square feet, it goes on top of the part. So let's say, for example, now the problem tells you that there are 15,000 square feet. The length or the front foot is 100, and it wants to know what the width or the depth is. What's our back fourth line mean? It means divide. You guys are so cute. I can see your mouths move. It means divide. Does your family wonder what we do in here all morning? They should. Yell at the screen. I can't hear you. I think it's great. So we take 15,000 divided by 100, and we're going to get a width, that's right, of 150. See how we can use the T-bar again. If they give you length times width, you may not want to use the T-bar. I don't want to complicate things. But I think where the T-bar comes handy is when they give you one or the other in the square feet, and you got to divide something. So this kind of helps us determine what to divide. Good so far. Everybody still with me? Okay. Let's pretend that we're looking at a kitchen. This is our kitchen. We'll call it a kitchen. And the length of the kitchen is 11 feet, 3 inches. And the width is, I'm making stuff up, 12 feet, 6 inches. So we go, we measure the kitchen. How do we measure the kitchen? We're going to talk about that in Unit 8. Okay, we're going to talk all about measuring in Unit 8. So we go and measure the kitchen, and we find out that this kitchen is 11 feet, 3 inches by 12 feet, 6 inches. When you're doing problems like this, you need to speak the same language of the problem. Feet and inches are two different things. So what we need to do is convert our inches to feet. How many inches are in 1 foot? How many inches are in 1 foot? 12, right? So the first thing we need to do is take our 3 inches, divide it by 12, and I get 0.25. So that 11 feet, 3 inches shakes out to 11.25 feet. Everybody see what we did there? I took my inches and I didn't touch the feet, but I converted my inches to feet by dividing my inches by 12. How many inches in a foot? 12. So now we do the same thing. I take my inches, divide it by 12. I get 0.5. So now I've converted 12 feet, 6 inches to 12.5 feet. Now I have numbers I can work with, right? Now I can do 11.25 times 12.5, and that'll give me how many square feet are in this kitchen. A question came in, can you convert to inches? Yes, but I feel like your answer choices are going to be feet. I've never seen an answer choices that are inches. So what's the opposite of divide? Multiply. So if you wanted to convert your feet to inches, you could do that. Let's see. So length measures east to west or north to south. No, length is referring to, again, this is our front foot. When you're in the home, when you're in the kitchen, usually the length is where the doorway is. If you have 2 doorways, and you may just have to, pick one and figure it out. When you're measuring a kitchen, there isn't a right. It's just the front foot that we need to be very careful about. And remember, we're recording. So I don't want you to feel kind of lost, but you may want to make a note to go back and review this again. I think sometimes repetition, if you guys write things over and over and over, if you write length times width equals square feet 20 times on a piece of paper, do you think you're going to remember it? Absolutely. It's that repetition. Did anybody ever get in trouble in school and you had to go to the blackboard or the whiteboard and write something 100 times? Mine was usually, I will not talk in class. Did anybody ever have to do that? I won't throw spit wads, or, whatever you had to do. Why do you think they made you do that? It wasn't to be mean. It was that repetition. If you went to the blackboard and wrote, I will not talk in class 100 times, the next time I go to talk in class, I may think twice about it, right? My hand may cramp a little bit, and I may say, oh man, I don't want to throw spit wads because I don't want to have to do that again. That's that repetition. So write it out 20 times, put it on a flashcard. All formulas go on flashcards. Is the length and width switched around? Nope. Length times width. Oh, you mean on my drawing? Yeah, it might be. You could argue that the length is argued, then yeah. This is me coming up with examples on the fly. Again, when we're measuring a square or a rectangle, we're looking at length times width equals square foot, or front foot times depth equals square foot. Do I have everybody? Everybody good so far? The other shape we may encounter is a triangle. And for our purpose, for simplicity, can we all agree that a triangle is half of a square? Can I get everybody on board? For our part, again, we're not getting into obtuse triangles or all that other mess. The triangles we deal with, a triangle is half of a square. So how do you find the square foot of a triangle? Length times width, cut it in 2, divide it by 2. Question comes in, is width usually a bigger number than length, or does it matter? Doesn't matter. The length is the first dimension given. The front foot is the first dimension given. You could have a shotgun lot, right, where it has a little bit of front footage, but it goes deep. It goes way back. So don't get into what's the longer end. The length or the front foot is the first dimension given. The width or the depth is the second dimension given. What does your formula tell you? Length times width. Triangle, take length times width, cut it in 2, divide it by 2. So, everybody good? Tell me in a private chat, I want to know the front feet of this lot, the square feet, and the acres. Give you about 30 more seconds and then we'll talk about it. Okay. So the first thing we were asked to do is find the front feet. And the front feet is the portion of the lot that runs parallel to the road. So what's the front feet? This property has 150 front feet. Front feet. Good so far? Okay. Second up, we're asked to find the square feet. The square feet tells us length times width. My length or my front foot is 150. My width or depth is 50. So length times width tells me 150 times 50 gives me 7,500 square feet. How many square feet are in this lot? 7,500. Good on that. Second thing wants to know how many acres. More than or less than 1 acre. Less than. How do we know? Because 7,500 is less than 43,560. Okay. So again, if one of your answer choices says 2 acres, you don't have to pick up a calculator to rule that out, right? You can look at that. So how many acres? I have 7,500 square feet, 43,560 acres, 7,500 divided by, oops, divided by 43,560, and I get 0.17 acres. For my math or my formula people, my non-T-bar people yet, all we did was took 150 times 50, length times width equals square foot. And then we took 7,500 and divided by 43,560, got 0.17. Questions? Can I erase the pink? Everybody good? Speak now. Okay. You may see a math problem in your practice. And the reason, I don't know that you're going to see this on your test, but it's on your practice. And I think it's good because it makes you guys think. And the reason I'm bringing it up, sometimes I like you guys thinking things through. I get so many questions about this math problem in your practice. I think it's in the Unit 4 material in your book. But there's a question that says that they are repaving the street and they're doing an assessment based on the front footage. And in the solution, you're going to, once you get to your answer, you're going to divide by 2. And the question I always get is, why do I divide by 2? And the answer to that is because somebody owns the lot across the street. So you're sharing that expense of the street. Does that make sense? I'll let you guys figure the rest out. But that's the question I get. Why do we divide by 2? Because you're sharing it with your neighbor across the street. I don't know who owns it. I don't care. But I know somebody owns it and they're going to share that expense. Make sense? I'll give you that little trick. Please, I'll never hesitate to reach out to me, but that's just a question I get a lot. So a question comes in, why don't we include the other 2 numbers? Because, and that's a good question, thank you, because what's my formula tells me? The length times the width. So all I have to do to find the square footage is take my length of 150 times my width of 50. In the real world, let's talk about in practice for a second. I wish it was this easy when you're measuring land. I wish all lots were perfect squares and rectangles, but they're not. So we're just introducing you to the basics. Once you guys get your license, you'll get more training. And part of that training will be, how do you look at the lot dimensions? And in the real world, let me say this too, you and I are not out there measuring lots. We're looking at lot dimensions provided to us on surveys, for example, on plat maps. I tell you what, though, if you are in a you know, squarish, rectangular-ish lot, and you're with your buyers, and you're walking this lot, and your buyers say, I wonder how many acres this is. There's not much more that can impress them than when you whip out your calculator and say, oh, this is 0.17 acres. Your buyers are going to go, wow, my agent knows what she's doing. She converted that number without ever thinking about it. Y'all don't give them that secret of 43,560. That's our secret. Okay, no, I'm just kidding. You can share it with them if you want. Okay, squares, rectangles, and triangles. The only shape, well, I got one more shape to deal with. We'll talk about that in a second. It's a combination of the three. All right, something else you may, and hear me stress the word may, we're not going to get bogged down on this. You may have a question of square yards. There are 9 square yards. Let me think. There are 9 square feet in a square yard, something like that. So the only thing you guys need to worry about, if you see this, does everybody hear me? If you see this, to find square yards, you just take length times width and divide it by 9. This is how they measure for like carpet, flooring. If you're going to get new tile, new laminate flooring, vinyl flooring, carpet, things like that, that's the language that they speak. So just jot that down. And we're going to move on. May, if. The syllabus tells me to cover it, so there we go. All right. There's also just some verbiage. Remember what we said last week? Sometimes in a word problem, what the word per means. What does the word per mean? We said of means multiply. So per sometimes means divide. So when you hear the verbiage cost per square foot or cost per acre, it's giving you the formula. So when you hear the verbiage, we're trying to determine cost per square foot. We're trying to determine how much does each square foot cost. So let's just pretend, I'm making numbers up as I go. We know how that works out for me sometimes, but let's just pretend that the property costs $200,000. And there are 1,800 square feet. Cost per square foot. The entire cost is $200,000. And their total property has 1,800 square feet. So how much does each square foot cost? $111. Every square foot in that house is worth $111. That's all we're saying there. Again, cost per acre. The entire cost of the land, the entire tract of land, let's go a little bit bigger now, is $2 million. And there are 18 acres. No, 18. Cost per acre tells us when you take the cost of the land of $2 million, divide it by the number of acres of 18, tells me that each acre costs $111,111. That's hard. 111, comma 111. You can see it. So again, when you hear sometimes just the verbiage, cost per square foot, cost per acre, this is one way that we may study the property when trying to determine price, asking price, listing price. The seller looks at you and says, how much should I list my house for? This might come up in conversation. We're going to talk about price, how we can help the seller determine asking price, how we can help our buyers determine if they're making a good offer at a good price. We're going to get into that in Unit 8 as well. So cost per square foot, per equals divide. Y'all write that down if you don't have it yet. Per equals divide. Of equals multiply. We're taking the words in the word problem and we're using them to our advantage. Everybody with me? Everybody good? Isn't this fun? All right. Here's our funny shape. I know we say we're only dealing with scale squares and rectangles and triangles, but we may get the opportunity to measure something called a trapezoid. And a trapezoid is a combination of a couple different shapes. So first off, let's talk about when the heck we would see a trapezoid in real estate. You guys see my bay window here? This looks like it's coming from a kitchen, maybe a breakfast area, a breakfast nook. It juts out from the rest of the house. It goes further than beyond the rest of the house. So for example, you have your breakfast area, and then you have your bay window that kind of comes out like that. Everybody see what we're doing? So I can go in and measure the breakfast area, right? I can get my length times width for the breakfast area. But then if my bay window qualifies for total living square foot, which we will talk about in Unit 8, I need to know how to measure that bay window to give it its square footage. When you guys see a trapezoid or a bay window, you need to, and I'm going to redraw my drawing a little bit here so we can see it. So here's our bay window. I'm no artist, so bear with me. When you guys are doing problems with bay windows, jot it down on your scratch paper, draw it out on your scratch paper, and then take your pencil and break this thing up. And we're going to break it up into 3 different shapes. I took that trapezoid and I made it into one rectangle, and 2 triangles. Don't I have a shape now that I can measure? Because what I know how to measure, squares and rectangles and triangles. So if you're given a shape that you don't know how to measure, you may have to chop it up. Not all houses are perfect squares and rectangles. Not all rooms are perfect squares and rectangles. So you may have to chop it up, break it up to get the appropriate dimensions. Let's say, for example, the problem gives me the dimensions of this bay window. And this tells me this is 10 inches. This is 14 inches. And then my up down line here is like 2 inches, both sides, 2 inches on both sides. So what we're going to do, that was my 14. There we go. So what we're going to do is chop this thing up. The first thing I want to do is find the square footage of the rectangle. How do I solve for a rectangle? Length times width. So when I take the length of my rectangle, which is 10, times the width, which is 2. My rectangle is 10 by 2. So that gives me square feet of 20. Do I have everybody so far? 10 times 2 is my rectangle. Then I need to figure out my triangles. The whole bottom base is 14 inches. Yes? I just used up 10 for the triangle. I'm sorry, for the rectangle. I just used up 10 for the rectangle. So how many do I have left? 4. And I can reason that each side has 2. Everybody see what I did? I took that 14, I allotted for 10 at the top, and then it gave me 4 left. So that means 2 on each side. That's right, 2 on each side. So now I'm going to change colors here so we can see it a little bit better. So now if I want to measure my triangle, I take the length, let's do it over here, the length of the triangle times the width, right? And then what do we do with the triangle? Chop it, I meant to do that, chop it in 2. We divide it out, right? So the triangle gives me 2 by 2, which is 4, and then divided by 2, which is 2. How many triangles do I have? 2. So to find the total, I take the square feet of my rectangle plus my 2 triangles. So how many square feet are in this bay window? 24. The key to this is to chop it up into shapes that you know how to measure. What do we know how to measure? Square, rectangle, triangle.
Miss Julie, I have a question.
Yes.
Would you be able to do a practice problem of just a triangle? I think we kind of skipped that. I know it's length times width divided by 2. But can I see
Sure.
it?
So if we have our triangle, right, we're all good. Triangle is half a square. That's all we're saying here. And let's pretend that my length is, I'm going to make numbers up, 10, my width is 15. So to find this triangle, I take 10 times 15, length times width, and I get 150. And a triangle is half of a square. So how do I make something half? I divide it by 2.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Don't let trapezoids intimidate you. 1 rectangle, 2 triangles. And of course, you got practice. Never, ever fear about that. Never worry. Is Julie going to give me practice? Yes. Yes, she is. We'll talk in just a second about where you can find that practice. Okay. Y'all ready to do some on your own? Yay. Yes. Oh, come on. Tell me in a private chat, A, B, C, or D. I love it when you guys answer with question marks. Like, are you asking me? I love it. I get that. Do about 30 more seconds and then we'll talk about it. Okay, so what do we do first when we see a problem? Word problem, math problem, what do we do first? Just read. Breathe and read. Read and breathe, okay? A lot with a depth of 80 feet in an area of 4,800 square feet has sold for $350 per front foot. What was the total sales price? Are you guys a visual person? Are you visual people? Do you like to see what it is? I love pictures. So the first thing I'm going to do is draw out my lot. I'm going to actually see my lot. And the problem tells me that I have a depth of 80 feet. We know the depth is how deep it is, right? The problem tells me it has 4,800 square feet. The problem doesn't tell me, though, what the length is. Right? So I took the information that I had first on the problem and I gave myself a visual. I gave myself something I could see. So what's the first thing I need to do? Because the question's asking me, what is it per front foot? So don't I need to first find the front foot? I need that to do the second step, right? If I don't know that number, then I don't know how to look at that. So I can use, again, you can use your A times B equals C, or you can use the T-bar. I know 4,800, what I'm solving for is my length, and I know 80. So I'm going to divide 4,800, whoops, divided by 80, and I'm going to get a depth or a width of 60. What is my front feet? 60 feet. How do I know that? Because I knew the square feet and I knew the length or the depth. So the first thing I have to do is find the length. The problem wants to know $350 per front foot. How many front feet are there? 60. So if I know there are 60 front feet and it sells for $350, now I'm kind of going the different way than what I went before, right? I'm not looking at cost per front feet. I'm looking at $350 per front feet. So if I have 60 square feet and each one goes for $350, I take 60 times 350 and I get the cost of this lot of $21,000. Per means divide most of the time. But if you took 60 times or 60, let's see, 350 divided by 60, I'm getting $5.83. So if you got that answer, you know that's not right. One, because it doesn't make sense for the whole lot to cost $5.83. And two, it's not a choice. Sometimes you just got to play around with the numbers, you guys, especially as you're learning. Questions on this one? We drew it out. We looked at our T-bar. Perfect. Did you get A? Awesome. So 350, and I can see that. I understand. Somebody said the per confused me. That's why I can't say the per means divide every time. It means divide a lot of the times. Depth is width, correct. Front feet is length. Depth is width. Okay, let's try another one. Tell me in a private chat, A, B, C, or D. really like it when you guys answer with exclamation points. Be proud of your answer, right or wrong. Be proud of it. It is your answer. Own it. Give me about 30 more seconds. Okay. How many acres are contained in a rectangular land parcel that has a length of 175 feet and a depth of 685? How do I, let me back up. In order to find, what's the question asking me? The question wants to know how many acres. In order to convert to acres, I first have to find square feet. Yes. So I got to do a step before I can do that. And how do I choose to draw pictures. I want to see it out. I have a rectangular lot. My length is 175. My depth or width is 685. So the first thing we need to do is find length times width, our square feet. So 175 times 685 gives me 175 times 685 times 685. There we go. I have a total square feet of 119,875. How many square feet are in this lot? 119,875. How do I know that? Because length times width equals square feet. Now the next step is to figure out how many acres. Again, if one of these answer choices was, less than an acre, we know that's wrong, right? 119,875. Is that more than or less than 43,560? That's more than. So we know, again, this one doesn't have it, but if you had an answer choice less than an acre, we knew that would be wrong. And now we can use our T-bar. I'm solving for acres. I have my square feet of 119,875, and I just know my magic number, 43,560. Back fourth line means divide. So on your calculator, you take 119,875 and divide it by 43,560, and we get 2.75 acres. How many acres are in this lot? 2.75. Sydney, I'm not sure that would work every time. So my suggestion is to either have the formulas or use the T-bar. I don't want to, I would hate to tell you wrong. So sometimes we can look at the answers and rule things out, and sometimes we just gotta pick up the calculator. 4 old ladies going 35 and a 60. Isn't that cute? Okay. Everybody good? Area math. And remember, you guys, there is more math in Unit 4 than what you guys need to worry about. Okay. If you want to get bogged down with it, by all means, it's there. Knock yourself out. Okay. But if you just want to focus on what we covered, square feet, acres, square yards, trapezoid, that's what I need you guys to focus on Unit 4. Fair enough? All right. Before we go to break, hang with me 1 minute. Let's go ahead and wrap this up. So officially finishing up Unit 4. Officially finishing up Unit 4. The key terms, remember the other day in Unit 4, we talked about legal descriptions and the survey and meets and bounds and all that good stuff. Here's your key terms. Your key point review is on page 81. Use this as a checklist. It's a review. You can go through that key point review and say, I know this, this, and this. And then you say, I don't know that. That's what you need to go back and look up. And then that student quiz, page 82 to 84. And when it comes to math, we now know practice, practice, practice. Yes. So the math concepts for unit 4 is on page 80. The math facts in the back of the book, 775 to 779, it talks about a trapezoid. For example, these are the pages that kind of talk about the math that we just did. So that gives you another math concepts, math section. Remember those 50 problems in the back of the book on pages 803 to 808? The numbers that you're looking at are the ones that relate to the math that we just did. So 50 extra problems in the back of the book. I tend to call these 201 because these ones in the back of the book tend to be a little bit harder. So my suggestion is master what you got in the unit. Once you get that, then move on to the back of the book. If you can do these ones in the back of the book, you will be good to go. And then there's some extra math in Learn, Test, Pass. If you look under the Unit 4 material, there's a quiz. I'm sorry, Unit 5 material. There's a quiz that's for Unit 4 and Unit 5. So that Unit 5 quiz kind of combines. Thank you. I was going to say somebody requested the Facebook link if you're interested in joining a study group. It's up and running, I'm guessing. So you got the link there in the chat if you guys will look at that. I see a couple of you are trying to connect, and I think that's great so you can study. I think study groups are great as long as somebody keeps you on point. It's really hard to get off track. So somebody's got to keep you guys on point. Don't spend your study time socializing. This is your study time. Okay. Questions? All right. Before we go to break, and it looks like a couple of you are already gone, so I hope you hear me. Please remember, if you have to come back late, guys, we get 10 minutes. And if you have to come back late and you miss attendance, you've got to tell me in the chat that you're back. I cannot interrupt class to mark you present. There are 50 some of you and one of me. So how I do attendance is by screenshots and then looking for you in the chat. Okay, so please don't expect that I'm going to stop class to look for you. I don't have time. We don't have time. So if you have to come back late, tell me in the chat, Julie, I'm back now. Fair enough? All right, let's take 10. We're going to pick back up in Unit 5 where we left off when we get back. right. So we're back. Cameras are coming on. We'll wait just a second and take attendance so we can make sure we see you. We are taking attendance. Thank you. All right. So let's go back into Unit 5. Let's go back and pick up where we left off. And we ended here last week. So you guys already have this jotted down. We ended kind of in the throes of the conversation about title insurance. And remember what we said is that title insurance protects the owner from errors of the past. You guys, please remember, today they're the buyer, tomorrow they're the owner, right? So when we talk about an owner's policy for title insurance, we're talking about the new owner. And it's protecting that new owner from errors of the past. So if anything comes up that affects title during the time before they owned it, they have title insurance to protect them. Again, if we just think about what insurance is, you know, if you get hurt, if your car breaks down or whatever, then you have insurance to protect you, yes? And that's all title insurance is to protect you in case something goes wrong. So we saw this last week. We actually ended here. And we were talking about two policies with title insurance, maybe two policies. The owner is going to have a policy. Remember, today they're the owner. I'm sorry, today they're the buyer, tomorrow they're the owner. And the owner's policy covers them for as long as they own the property. Maybe that be 2 months, maybe that be 30 years. The title insurance policy covers the owner for as long as they own the property. This isn't something that has to renew every year. They pay for it one time at closing and it covers them for as long as they own the property. If the buyer is getting a loan, then the lender has an interest too. So the lender is going to have a policy. But the lender's policy is going to be a diminishing liability, which means as you pay that property off, the lender's interest diminishes. The lender's interest goes down. Why does the lender care? Well, let's think this through for a second. We're going to talk all about the lender in units 14 and 15. When we get there, we actually get to put on a lender hat. But let's just talk this through about why the lender cares right now. Let's say you purchase a home for $100,000. Purchase price is $100,000. And you ask the lender, you say, I want a loan for 80%. How much is the lender bringing? If you're asking the lender for an 80% loan on a $100,000 home, the lender's bringing $80,000. Everybody with me? If the lender's bringing $80,000, how much are you bringing? You're bringing $20,000. Who has the biggest interest in this property? Is it you? I mean, your $20,000 is cute and all, but do you have the biggest interest in this property? No. So why does the lender care? Because they got 80 grand synced into this. Does that make sense? The lender has an issue with this property. The lender has a need to care about this property. And as you pay that $80,000 down, as you pay that off, their liability diminishes. Once you pay that loan off, the lender's out. Once you pay that loan off, the lender doesn't care. So everybody please understand, title insurance, again, we pay for it one time at closing. The buyer gets to pay for both policies, the owner and the lender's policies. You only pay for it one time and it carries you through. You don't have to renew it every year. What if the buyer's a cash buyer? What if it's a cash buyer? What if they're bringing the whole $100,000 themselves? Is the lender involved? No. So now how many policies do you have? Just one, right? Because you don't have the lender to begin with. Everybody good? 2 policies if you're getting a loan. Again, most of this unit is our attorney's unit, what the attorney's responsibility is. So the attorney is the one that needs to make sure that it's insurable title, marketable title, clear title. That is the seller's biggest responsibility, is to hand off to the buyer, to the new owner, clear marketable title. And how do we know that they're handing it off? The buyer hires the attorney to make sure that they're getting insurable title. Title insurance does not release their policy until they have a title opinion from the attorney. This is why the attorney does the thorough record search, public record search. They're finding everything that could possibly affect the title for this property. And upon their opinion, that is when title insurance will issue their policy or policies. Usually the way this happens, shortly after we go under contract, and we will talk all about the contract to closing process, we will get there. But shortly after we go under contract, the attorney is going to do a very in-depth, very thorough search of the title. Because if they find anything other than unpaid liens that the seller has to pay before they can convey, if they find anything else, encroachments, for example, well, the survey would help them find that. But maybe an old forged document, maybe somebody's not on the deed, that's a spouse that needs to sign, just as an example. If they find anything wrong, the attorney will get with the seller to clear it up. So shortly after we go under contract, there's this very big, thorough search of the title of the property. Find anything, we'll fix it. And then one of the last acts that the attorney does, now fast forward to closing. And one of the very last things that the attorney does is they do another quick title search just to make sure nothing came up on the title when they did the big title search back in the day when we went under contract. So based on that, they do their preliminary and then their final, just quick, make sure nothing hit. Based on that, they issue their opinion. So let's look at a couple examples together. A title policy is issued on July 12, 2017. It is later discovered that a 2010 deed to the seller was forged and is void. Title insurance will indemnify the buyer because this title, the owner will say, because this title existed prior to the effective date of the policy and could not have been discovered by a public record search. So the attorney can only find what he can find or she can find. And if it's something that couldn't be discovered, title insurance will protect the owner, will protect today they're the buyer, tomorrow they're the owner. Trinidad, look at that on break. Here's another example. A buyer is buying a home and declines to have the survey done before closing. They waive the survey. After closing, the buyer discovers that a neighbor's garage encroaches on the buyer's property by 2 feet. The owner's title insurance policy does not compensate the buyer or the owner for those title defects, because guess what? Title insurance is going to say, had you gotten the survey done, we would have discovered this and we would have taken care of it and we wouldn't have this issue now. If anything comes up on the title that could have been discovered, title insurance will go after the former owner, the seller first. Because one of the documents that the seller signs at closing is an affidavit saying this can't happen. And so now it has happened, they're going to go after the seller. What if the seller is broke or dead or MIA? Then title insurance may have to compensate. But they're not going to compensate buyers or owners for issues that they could have discovered. For example, had they had a survey done. So question comes in, what would be the outcome of the first? They may go after the buyer. Forgery gets tough. Forgery is very, very tough to prove. So they may go after the former seller and say, fix this, make it right. Or they may just work with their attorney to get it cleared up. But what we need to understand is the owner won't have to worry about this because this is something that couldn't have been discovered. Does that make sense? It's something that the attorney couldn't find. This one, the owner's out of luck because title insurance is going to say, if you just had a survey done, we would have known this problem. We wouldn't be here if you just had a survey done. Yet, this is probably the #1 reason why we want to encourage our buyers to have surveys. Again, I can't make anybody do anything. You guys going to document having this conversation with your buyers about the importance of a survey? Are y'all going to document? I need every single head to nod yes. Because what do we document? We document everything. Everything. Okay. So another job that the attorney does is record. Title recordation, when we talk about recording the new title, it's just the act of placing the documents in public record. Any document that affects real estate, title, interest in properties should be recorded. The whole reason we record is to give notice. Let everybody know I am the owner of record. And by recording, because you recorded your deed first, because you recorded first, you have priority. So if you have to go stand in front of a judge about whether or not this is your land or not, if you're the one on record, you may have a legal priority because you recorded first. Again, the attorney records everything, and there's a certain order that the attorney has to record. So for example, we talked about deeds of release. We mentioned that the other day, last week. Deed of release is when you pay the lien off, when you pay the loan. So before the seller can convey, they have to pay off any of their outstanding liens, right? So let's pretend that they have a mortgage on the property. The attorney has to cancel that mortgage first, date and time stamp, has to cancel that mortgage first once it's paid off. And then once they have all those canceled liens, paid off liens recorded, then they can record the buyer's new deed. But they can't record that new deed until they record the seller's lien satisfaction. It's got to be in a certain order. You got to be able to show that timeline. This mortgage was paid off. The property was conveyed. Here's the buyer's new deed, the owner's new deed. As soon as the attorney records the new deed, if there's a lender involved, the very next step will be to record the deed of trust, also known as the mortgage. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. The lender wants to be recorded first. Why? Because you pay superior liens, and then all liens are paid in the order in which they're recorded, except for the mechanics liens. So it's really important to the lender to protect their interest, to have their deed recorded, their deed of trust recorded, as soon as the attorney records the deed and deed of trust. As we just said, the seller's lien satisfaction, that's what we're referring to. We got to pay off the seller's existing liens, record those new lien payoffs, lien satisfaction, and then they record the buyer's new deed. When we get to Unit 21 is our contract to closing unit. We finally get to go to closing in Unit 21. And we're going to learn that the very last step, the final act of this whole process is when the buyer's new deed gets recorded. Then and only then is it a done deal. So in unit 21, we're going to talk more about what all we have to do up until that point. Yes, I'm in unit 5. I'm on page 100. So last week I introduced you to an act, and that act tells us that there are certain documents that have to be recorded. Who can tell me in a chat what that act was? There's an act that we discussed that said there are certain documents that have to be recorded. Who tells us that? Look at you guys. So that act is our North Carolina Connor Act. Connor is the act that says there are certain documents that have to be recorded. Why do we record? So you protect it against third parties. So you can enforce against third parties. If you have somebody showing up that thinks they may have an interest to your property, your recorded deed is going to be the leg up you need when you stand in front of the judge. So Connor Act is a state law. It says there are many real estate documents. We'll look at those documents in just a second that are only valid if they're recorded. You guys remember last week we talked about the essential elements of a deed. And with essential elements, we talked about like required cake ingredients, so flour, egg, oil, water. And then we talked about some extras, sprinkles and icing and a cherry on top. Connor is the extra. The deed is perfectly valid if it's not recorded. Why do we record deeds? Because Connor tells us to. The Connor Act tells us. A question comes in, what is third parties? Anybody else. You're the owner of record. You have the title of the deed. Anybody else that shows up and says, well, I have an interest in this property because my daddy's daddy owned it 50 years ago and he left it to me. Those long lost relatives that show back up sometimes, that's who we want to protect against. For example, they usually show up when we win a lot of money, right? When we win some money or get some property or they have a reason. That's when those long lost relatives kind of pop back up. What happened with the Connors Act? I'm not sure I understand that question. Are third parties considered encumbrances? No, because maybe they have a right to think, maybe they don't. That's a good question. So we say many types of documents are not valid unless they're recorded. So what are these documents that have to be recorded? Well, we've mentioned the deed. The deed of trust is just a fancy way of saying mortgage. So the lender's deed of trust to protect their interests. Leases for more than 3 years, Connor says we need to record. Easements have to be recorded, restrictive covenants. Something called an installment land contract and an option contract that we will talk about. We'll see these in Unit 10. And then assignments. If you're assigning anything, you're transferring your rights to somebody else. You're assigning your right to somebody else. So if it's a real estate assignment, Connor says it has to be recorded. So Connor specifically says, not just any real estate document, specifically these real estate documents. Somebody says, is Connor a real person? I don't know. He might have been named after somebody. Connor and I go way back. You know, I got my license in 2008, so I'm very familiar with Connor. So I guess that's why I refer to this Connor Act as a real person. It is not necessary to get recorded, but it's highly recommended. It is required to get recorded. Why? Because Connor says we have to. Connor says these documents, not highly recommended. Connor says these documents have to be recorded. Haley, hang on to that. We're actually going to talk about that in Unit 9. So hang on to that. You may need to remind me, but make yourself a note and we'll see that. Yep. So when it comes to recording, North Carolina is a pure race state, which means the first one to get to the courthouse wins. How do you make this deed yours? How do you make yourself the owner of record? You race to the courthouse and you get there first. There's a really good example in your book on page 101. And I think this also illustrates the importance of using a closing attorney. Why do we hire an attorney and let them do it? Let's look at this example on page 101, the second one near the bottom. Suppose Zackerman sells her property to Sands. Sands fails to record his deed. 2 weeks later, Shady Zackerman sells the same property to Hanson. Hanson suspects that Zackerman no longer owns the property, but accepts the deed and quickly records it. Because Hanson recorded his deed, he now has marketable title to the property. Sands is out of luck. Sands' recourse may be to sue, but Sands is not the owner of record. So in other words, when Sands stands in front of the judge and says, but I have a deed, the judge is going to say that's a valid deed, but it didn't get recorded. Last thing, well, next to last thing we're going to say, again, just mention this and move on because we don't do this in North Carolina, but other states may use a torn system. And it's just a land registration system. They register their property. And that's how they prove title. And I don't know what states do this. But what I know is that we don't usually do this in North Carolina because the Connor Act tells us. Question comes in, let's see. Because Hanson actually recorded, he has priority over the claimant. That's right. Because who recorded first? I'm going to go back for 1 second. Because North Carolina is a pure race state. The first one to record their document wins. And that's why Sands was out of luck. Could anything happen to Zackerman? I mean, we could sue him. You know, I'm not an attorney. I'm not a judge. I don't know how far we'll get, but we could sue him. Somebody says it's like when you buy a vehicle and you get the title is technically not yours until you register it with the DMV. There you go. There you go. Torn system, not used in North Carolina. Okay, pure race state. It's a race to the courthouse to record. First one there wins. Okay, so the last thing in Unit 8 is just a little bit of math. We have something called, did I say Unit 8? Unit 5, wherever we are. I'm on page 102. Don't listen to me, just look at the screen. So the last thing is we're going to talk about something called excise tax. Excise tax is something that the sellers pay at settlement. All sellers get to pay excise tax. Y'all write that down. Paid by seller. Who pays excise tax? The seller. You may hear some of us old school people refer to excise tax as revenue stamps. You may hear some people refer to it as a transfer tax. It's all the same thing. Excise tax is calculated on the purchase price, not the list price, not the loan amount. It's calculated on the purchase price. An excise tax is going to be a number divisible by 500. We'll look at an example in just a second. There's a couple different ways we can do excise tax. We get the same result. It's a number that's divisible by 500. The key to excise tax, you're never going to have change. Excise tax is always going to be a whole dollar. So let's say, for example, you have a sales price or a purchase price of $249,750. There's two ways we can go about doing this. We'll get the same answer either way. So you have the sales price of 249,750. We just said excise tax was divisible by 500. So when you take the sales price, divide by 500, that's your formula for excise tax. Sales price divided by 500. So when we take our sales price of 249,750 divided by 500, I got 499.50. Is that a whole number? 499.50, is that a whole number? No. So I got one more step to do, right? So the next step I need to do is round up. Always round up with excise tax. Always round up. This is the government that we're talking about here. So you always round up. If your excise tax is 499.01, you're going to round up to $500. So when you do excise tax, if you ever have change, just round up to the nearest whole dollar. So at closing, the seller for this example is going to pay $500 in excise tax. The other way you could do this, 6 to 1, half dozen the other, is take the purchase price of 249,750 and round up to the nearest 500ths. 500ths means the purchase price is going to end in 000 or 500. So you take that price, you round up to the nearest 500ths, still divide by 500. And you get 500. I don't care how you do it. Either round up the purchase price and then divide by 500, or divide by 500, then round up. I don't care. And that's all the math in Unit 5. Did y'all write that down? You're going to divide something by 500. There's your formula. And that gets us through Unit 5. We're just checking stuff off left and right. So here's your key terms. Key point review on page 103. Student quiz on 106. I tend to think of Unit 5 as our attorneys unit. We spend a lot of time talking about the attorneys. You know, some people in this industry may tell you that what you learn in pre-licensing, you're never going to use in the real world. I would disagree with that all day long. I don't think you'll use everything you learn in pre-licensing in the real world. Like, guys, I'm going to be honest. I've never had a buyer look at me and say, what kind of deed should I get when I buy this property? I've never had that question. But don't I need a basic understanding of this process and how this works? Because I'm the one working with the buyers. Don't I need to constantly be looking out for red flags? Am I not assisting? So while I'm not training you guys to be attorneys, we're not in law school. I'm not training you guys to be attorneys. What we're trying to accomplish in Unit 5 is a very basic understanding of how this process works. Always let the attorney do their job. You do yours. Fair enough? And then the math concepts, that just talks about our excise tax. There is nothing in the back, but there's some practice in Unit 5. We'll see excise tax again when we get into Unit 21, because part of going to closing is calculating buyers and sellers' costs. How much does the buyer have to bring to closing? How much is the seller going to get? So we get to look at debits and credits for both parties. So we'll see excise tax again. Before we jump into Unit 6, I want to talk about a couple things, then we'll take a break and then we'll do Unit 6, but don't go on break yet. Go back just for 1 second. Look with me on page 100. Page 100 in your book. I want you guys to impress yourselves. Part of what we're doing in these first couple units is building up to the good stuff. And on page 100, the first in practice. We have another excerpt from our standard sales contract, our standard offer to purchase and contract. Now we're going to look at our standard offer to purchase and contract in unit 10, but let's look at that paragraph. Seller shall execute and deliver a general warranty deed. Did you know what that meant 2 weeks ago? General warranty deed for the property in recordable form. What did that mean? No later than settlement, which shall convey fee simple, marketable, and insurable title without exception for mechanics liens and free from other liens, encumbrances, or defects, including those that which would be revealed by a current and accurate survey of the property, except ad valorem taxes for the current year, utility easements on violated covenants, conditions, or restrictions that do not materially affect the value of the property, and such other liens, encumbrances, or defects as may be assumed or specifically approved by the buyer in writing. The property must have legal access to public right of way. How many of those words did you not know 2 weeks ago? And now we're starting to understand the verbiage and what we're going to see in our standard sales contract that we use every day. So we're building up. This is why we're talking about the things that we do, because this is in our contract. Could you have a buyer or seller ask you what a general warranty deed means? Sure. Does that make you guys feel good? You know what some of those words mean? Again, I should have you guys read that on day one and then read it again today, because there are a lot of words you didn't know 2 weeks ago. And now you do. See, I'll give yourselves a pat on the back. You can do that. Patrick, there you go. See, we're doing good. All right. Again, one more thing before we jump into unit 6. I think unit 6 is the first unit that talks about us, the brokers. So unit 6 is our land use controls. We're going to talk about things like zoning and restrictive covenants, but this is actually the first unit that we bring our role into it. And we'll talk about what our roles are as we get there. But one thing I just kind of want you guys to consider. When you get your North Carolina real estate license, your license says that you can brokerage a transaction in any property that's located in the state of North Carolina. As long as the property is located in North Carolina, you can work with buyers or sellers or landlords or tenants. You will probably choose not to focus on the entire state of North Carolina. You will probably choose to focus on a certain area, a certain market. Maybe that area is Winston-Salem, maybe it's Forsyth County, maybe it's the Triad, for examples. You can choose where you want to work. And one thing that we need to understand, we are the experts of the market that we choose to work. We need to be familiar with the neighborhood, with the market, with the area. And one thing we need to understand, and we're going to learn in just a second, is that zoning affects each city, each municipality, each county. We're getting ready to learn there is no across the board zoning for everything in the state. It's all local in nature. So if you want to take on the Triad, you need to know how to find zoning, highway, subdivision. We're going to talk about all this, but you need to know how to find that information so you can be the expert of your market. We buy and sell houses, but those things come and go. It's the area that we know. It's the market that we're familiar with. Does that make sense? So one thing you guys may want to do is start learning your area, your market, thinking about where you want to work. Do you want to start with your neighborhood or your city? This is Winston-Salem. I just went to Google and I typed in Winston-Salem zoning and this page came up. Any of your city websites would be a good place to kind of start learning about the area, learning about the market. Another thing you guys may want to do, does anybody like to go open housing on the weekends? what I call it, go in and kind of check out some open houses, do it. We're getting to a point now where we're starting to do open houses again. I mean, homes are staying on the market longer than, 12 hours. So we're getting back to the place where we're doing open houses again. So if you see an open house, stop by. That's a good way for you guys to start seeing what the inside looks like, the various markets you want to work. If you're driving around and you see a for sale sign in the yard, safely pull over and look it up on your phone. Find out what the asking price is. Start learning about these homes for sale in your market, in your area. Turn GPS off of your highway. Take the back roads, take the side roads, go through subdivisions, and just start learning your area. That's a big way. When I moved to High Point, it was in 2000. Gosh, is that right? Yeah, I moved to High Point in 2000. And that's how I learned High Point. Where's this road take me? And this was before the day of, that I knew of GPSs. So just kind of start exploring and learning. And like I said, if you see an open house, can anybody do an open house? Of course. All I ask, if you guys go into an open house, just be honest with the agent. Don't walk in the front door acting like a super interested buyer. Please don't do that to the agent. Will you guys promise me that? Fair enough. Go in and say, I'm in pre-licensing. I noticed you had an open house and I thought I'd just stop by and check it in. Just be honest with her, please, or him. So let's see, I had a couple questions come up. So let me go back. What do you do if you want to work outside North Carolina, like South Carolina? You need a South Carolina license. Yes, thank you, Dwayne. So you have, each state has its own real estate commission. So where we have the North Carolina Real Estate Commission, South Carolina has the South Carolina Real Estate Commission. California has the California Real Estate Commission. So I can be in pre-licensing and go open house? Absolutely. Virtual open houses? Yep, we did that a lot too. How long do they normally last? I think typically we have them Sundays 2 to 4, but I mean, my team just did an open house last Saturday. So you just want to check your website. What's your favorite site to search properties? Realtor.com, Zillow.com. What's your favorite site? If there's an open house, that's how you can find that on your favorite site. Let's see, if you get licensed in more than one state, can you work in two? Absolutely. That's why you can be dually licensed. Have I ever been licensed outside of North Carolina? No, I'm securely here. Can you have your license in multiple states? Yeah, sure. Why not? Anybody live right on the border? Anybody live up within miles from Virginia or miles within South Carolina? Or Tennessee, you may want to consider getting your license in that other state, because you guys know there's some weird places in the country where like one side of the street is North Carolina and then you cross the street and you're into Virginia. So if you're that close to that market, you can show your North Carolina license says you can do the house in North Carolina, but you can't cross the street and do Virginia unless you have a Virginia license. Everybody with me? So you can only brokerage deals on properties located in North Carolina. I don't care where you are standing. It's where the property is located. I'm getting a lot of questions about how you get licensed in other states. I don't know that. Contact the South Carolina Real Estate Commission. Contact the Virginia Real Estate Commission. They're all different, you guys. So if you want to get licensed in another state, remember our goals, one thing at a time. I highly recommend we stay focused on North Carolina license. Once you get that North Carolina license, if you want to get licensed in another state, go to that real estate commission and find out what you have to do. Fair enough? But one thing at a time. I know you guys want to do 5 states and tackle the world and sell every house from coast to coast. I hear you. But before you can do any of that, I need you to focus. Remember your goals and focus, and just focus on North Carolina, because that's where you are right now. So that's where you're gonna start. So let's see, how do I get dual license? Contact that state. I would definitely recommend specializing in an area that you know. There's that old saying, just because I can doesn't mean I should. We'll talk about that a little bit more. What brokerage am I with? I guess I can answer that. I've never been asked that before. I'm with a company called Blue Door Group. We're in Winston-Salem. Do you have to take other state tests to be licensed by other states? Depends. Do you still houses while teaching? Funnily enough, I've recently took a step back from sales for various reasons, and I've picked up an admin role. So I'm kind of the behind the scenes person of my real estate firm now. If you saw our open house advertised last Saturday, that was me. I did that. So I'm kind of taking on the back seat behind the role. My plate's only this big, right? Just like yours is. So I got to find that balance. You have one of our pens. That's awesome. I have to we got little fuzzy blue haired pens. So that's so funny. All right. So just kind of get you guys thinking, right? I don't want to get too much more distracted, but I want you guys to start thinking about where you're heading, you know, what you want to do with your license, that kind of thing. But again, let's reel it back in now, and our goals, we got to get through this stuff first before you can go out and sell a house. Okay. So don't let your open housing and your property searching on Zillow.com take all of your study time. Okay. Remember those goals. So with that being said, let's take 10. When we come back, we're going to jump into unit 6. All right. So we're back. You guys ready to jump into Unit 6? Yay. All right, cameras are on. So I'm going to take attendance. Say cheese, cheese. All right, Unit 6 is land use control. There are certain ways that how we use our land is controlled. So that's what we're going to talk about in Unit 6, how we use our land, the controls of how we use our land. So in this unit, we're going to identify that we have public land use controls and we have private land use controls. We got a lot of words, terms to define in this unit. So we're going to define some words. And then again, this is the first unit that we bring brokers into it. So we're going to talk about our responsibilities when it comes to these public and private controls. So first off, let's talk about public land use controls. Public land use controls are regulated by the police. They're regulated by the government. If there's a violation of a public land use controls, you call the law. The biggest public land use control that we're getting ready to talk about is zoning. And that's a governmental affair. Again, any issues with, for example, zoning, call the cops. The cops help enforce these public land use controls. Zoning, we're going to learn, should be created, should be established. The whole goal is to protect the public health, safety, and general welfare of the citizens. Public land use controls are regulated by the government, the local government. Each local city or town or municipality has its own master plan. And the master plan, did you guys ever get the question, where do you see yourself 10 years from now? That's the city's master plan. Where do we see ourselves 20 years from now? What kind of growth can we expect? Can we expect any decline? What can we do to prevent decline? What can we do to help aid in growth? Can we bring in, an Amazon warehouse, for example? Anything that the government does needs to comply with that city's or that town's master plan. And probably the biggest example of public land use control that we see is zoning. Zoning are laws imposed by the local government. Zoning regulates and controls how we use our land and the structures. Zoning may dictate, for example, a setback requirement. When I talk about a setback, how far back from the road does the property have to be? Is there a 30 feet setback requirement? Because you can't build 30 feet close to the road, for example. You guys make a note to just look over, if you haven't already, look over pages 110 and 111. There's just some good examples. All those bullet points on those 2 pages, make yourself a note, talks about things that public land use controls include, the master plan, and then zoning regulations. So that'll give you an idea of various things that zoning may impact, zoning may regulate. Zoning should not violate the rights of property owners. And zoning needs to be flexible. Things change. Companies come and go. So zoning needs to be flexible so it can adapt. So it can keep its city or town or municipality current with the changes. There's a great example in your book on page 112. In many large cities, factories and warehouses sit empty. Some cities have begun changing the zoning ordinances for such properties to permit new residential commercial developments in areas once zoned strictly for heavy industrial use. Coupled with tax incentives, the changes lure developers back into the cities. The resulting housing is modern, conveniently located, and affordable. Simple zoning changes can help revitalize whole neighborhoods in big cities. You guys been to downtown Winston-Salem lately? This is happening right now as we speak, isn't it? They're taking all those old RJR warehouses and they're converting them into nice apartments and condos. If you've had the privilege of seeing one of those things yet, they are nice. High Point's working on, that's another way to translate it in Holly. High Point is working on its zoning, trying to bring, they're building new towns, or not new towns, new buildings, new restaurants, and they're offering tax incentives to businesses to move downtown, have a presence downtown. If you're familiar with High Point, you know, unless it's furniture market, it's as dead as it can be in downtown High Point, at least 2-3 years ago. So we got a new baseball team. We have some new buildings. You're starting to see some life in downtown High Point. Yes. I can dig that. I think it's happening everywhere though. Again, back to Winston-Salem, you know, the mayor of Winston-Salem was quoted 10 years ago. He was quoted as saying that you could fire a cannon down 4th Street after 5 p.m. and not hit a soul. Is that the case now on 4th Street in Winston-Salem? Not even a little bit, isn't it? See how much things have changed because they can offer some incentives. They can rezone because they're flexible. Okay. We have something called the North Carolina Enabling Act. This is really important, and I feel like this even might be a problem topic. So let's make sure we're good on this. Zoning is local in nature. What do I mean by that? There is no nationwide standard. There is no statewide standard. Raleigh, the government officials of Raleigh are not going to come to Winston-Salem and say, this is how you have to do your zoning. Do you know who regulates and controls Winston-Salem zoning? Winston-Salem. It's local in nature. Raleigh can't show up and say, we're going to do a statewide zoning. Okay, so it's local in nature, which means, remember all these markets that you want to work when you tackle on the state of North Carolina? You're going to have to be familiar with all those zonings, all those different counties and cities and tax and municipalities, because they're all different, all of them. So with our public land use controls, there's general classifications. You should see residential, commercial, industrial, and agricultural. Each classification usually is subdivided into a subclassification. So for example, for residential zoning, you might have single family use or multifamily use. Okay. For commercial, you might have subclassifications of office or retail. We could have mixed zoning. There are areas where residential and commercial cohabitate. There are areas where they're in the same building. Again, go to downtown Winston. You could have stores on the first floor, and then stories 2 through 18 could be residential apartments or condos. So we could have a mixed zoning. Question comes in, how often do buyers ask about zoning? It does come up a lot with commercial. It could come up with residential as well too, and we will talk about that. That's where our role comes into place. So we absolutely will talk about that. So all these classifications could have subclassifications. You could have a mixed use, which means you have 2 types of zoning approved, allowed for one area. So now what we need to do, and this is not the fun part of Unit 6, I apologize, but it is what it is. Starting on page 112, we just need to define some basic zoning terms, okay? I don't think you're going to get, if you do get a test question, it's going to give you a scenario and it's going to say, you know, like which zoning term does this apply? So we need a basic understanding of the terms. So the first zoning term we have is cluster zoning. An example of cluster zoning is a cul-de-sac. You're going to slightly reduce the lot sizes to increase your open space. That's what we're doing in a cul-de-sac, is we're increasing that space. So cluster zoning is a term that we just need to have a very basic understanding of. A buffer zone is a strip of land used to separate two types of zoning. So for example, you might have a strip of land that's protected and you can't mess with or build on or tear down that strip of land because its purpose is to buffer between residential area and commercial area, or residential area and an industrial area. Can you guys see my picture here? It looks like we got residents here. I got this buffer zone, this area of trees. And then over here, you know, I can't tell if we have a Walmart or a plant or what, but we got something big that isn't residential, right? That's what we're doing. We're keeping those two zonings separate. Buffer zone is protected land. That's right, which means you can't come and tear these trees down. It's protected. Yep. Another zoning term is extraterritorial jurisdictions, also known as ETJs. These are areas that are outside of the city limits, but they may not have a big enough government to have their own zoning. So they kind of piggyback off of the adjacent area, the adjacent city. If this area ever becomes annexed, the ETJ goes away because now you're part of that city. You've been incorporated, you've been annexed into that territory. Usually ETJs and whether or not we can annex you into the city or not comes down to population. But adjacent cities can regulate ETJs for up to 3 miles out. Again, usually comes down to population, whether you're an ETJ. As that ETJ grows, then you may be annexed into the city. You may be incorporated into the city. Another zoning term we have is non-conforming use. And I have two types of non-conforming use. There's legal non-conforming use and there's illegal non-conforming use. A non-conforming use, you're breaking the rules. A non-conforming use means you're using the property in a way that isn't allowed. Whether or not a non-conforming use is legal or illegal depends. A legal non-conforming use says that the use was in place and then they came and changed the rule. So the use was here and then they came in and they rezoned it and they changed it. They're not going to make you shut down. They're not going to make you close because they changed the rule. A legal non-conforming use means you are grandfathered in. You can still operate under these conditions. Let's say, for example, have you guys ever been in a residential neighborhood and seen like an old random gas station on the corner? That's probably a good example of a non-conforming use. Once upon a time ago, it was allowed. They've rezoned it. Now it's residential only, but they're not going to make that gas station close down. Now, what happens if that gas station owner wants to sell? Could the new owner use it as a gas station? Probably not. What happens if that gas station owner wants to do major renovations and they apply for building permits? Would they get approved? Probably not. Why? Because they're operating a non-conforming use. So they're not going to make you shut down, but they're not going to approve the use to continue. We will talk about building codes and permits in just a bit in this unit, so hang on. An illegal non-conforming use then says that the rule was already in place. You knew the rule or aware of it, and you went and started using the property in a way that it wasn't allowed. You now have an illegal non-conforming use. Somebody just asked if this was important when you're working with buyers in residential. Zoning was important. This is a great example of why it is. Let's say you're working with a buyer, and through the course of your communications and conversation, you learn that your buyer wants to convert their garage into a hair salon. As their agent, I now have a duty to, we can't talk about the test, please. As their agent, I now have a duty to make sure that the zoning allows for them to live there, residential and commercial, operate a business from there. You guys with me? That's my job, is to help them get that information. We'll talk about that in just a second. What if I do all this research and I tell my buyer it's only zoned residential? They buy the house anyway, convert the garage into a hair salon. They now have an illegal non-conforming use. They're using a property in a way that is not allowed. So whether or not it's legal or illegal, you need to ask yourself, which came first, the use or the rule? Non-conforming use. Question come in. Can they get a permit to make it apply? Possibly. They could go to the zoning board and request it. Are they going to get approval? I don't know. It's all local in nature. So could they go to the board? Sure, they can. Are they going to get approval? Don't know. Can't hurt to ask, though. What's the worst thing that the board can say? No. Another zoning term is a variance. A variance is a deviation from an ordinance. With a variance, the key to a variance, one property owner is asking permission to break the rules. How many property owners are asking permission? Just one. One property owner is going to the zoning board and they're saying, because of your zoning ordinances, I can't use my land the way I intended. Will you change the rules just for me? Are they going to grant it? Maybe they will, maybe they won't. If you see a variance, if you hear of a variance, this is why we need to understand important is just one property owner asking permission. That one property owner isn't getting permission for everybody in the neighborhood or everybody on the street. You guys understand? They're just asking for themselves. Again, you can go to the zoning board, make an appointment, get it on the docket, get on the meeting schedule, and make an appointment and stand in front of the zoning board and request a variance. Because of your rules, I can't use my property in the way I intended. Let's see, what's an example? Let's say we mentioned something earlier about that 30 feet setback. So what if the zoning says I can't build my house 30 feet to the road? It's got to be at least 30 feet back from the road. But 50 feet back from the road is a creek. And in order for me to build my house 30 feet back, I'd be building my house over a creek. Could that be a flood hazard waiting to happen? You betcha. So what could I do? I could go to the zoning board. I could ask permission for a variance and build 20 feet back instead of 30 feet back. I'm asking permission to break the rules. Question comes in, how's close to UNCG that are zone commercial? Are these variances? No, because we're just looking at one property owner. So probably what you have there is multi-zoning. I'm just guessing, I don't know, but probably what you have there is a very multi-zoning, different uses allowed. And we see that in areas like around a college, because you got businesses, you got dorms, you got residents, right? You got several different things going on. Another zoning term is a special use permit. You may also hear this referred to as a conditional use permit. This is allowed so that the public can use the property in one special way. It's what's in the best of the public interest. We're variating, but it's what's in the best for the public interest. So an example of a special use could be a church or a hospital or a school. Where are my Winston people? And further in Winston, let's go to Ardmore. We got all sorts of things going on in Ardmore, don't we? We got Ardmore Baptist Church. We got Miller Street School. We got Miller Street Park. You got several things going on in that residential area. Wake Forest Baptist Hospital is there. The outskirts, the border of Ardmore, if you will. Those are all special use permits. Question come in, would a variance pass if conveyed? You'd have to get the variance approved, but it would convey. It would be appurtenant. So in other words, the new owner wouldn't have to tear their house down because it's 20 feet, right? We already got permission to build. Good question, thank you. So special use permit. So that's right. Ardmore could be as a mixed use. It could be special use. I was trying to give an example. Another zoning term is called a zoning amendment. An amendment is a change. If you amend something, you are changing it. Okay, we're going to see this word again in Unit 10. I'm going to ask you guys all what an amendment is. And you're all going to tell me an amendment is what? It is a change. You're changing, you're requesting to change. So if you're requesting for a zoning amendment, you're requesting to change the zoning. So again, as we said earlier, property owner or owners go to a public hearing in front of the zoning board. You guys ever drive around and you see zoning signs? They're either white signs with red Z's or red signs with white Z's. When you see those are telling you of an upcoming zoning meeting, of an upcoming hearing for a possible zoning amendment. That's usually what they're trying to do, is make a change to the official zoning. Question came in, is Airbnb special use? That's a good question. I'm not going to answer that one way or another. I'm going to have to say that one depends. You could be looking at commercial. You could be looking at special use. So an amendment is a change. If you're requesting a zoning amendment, you're just requesting a change to the zoning. Remember, we said zoning is flexible. So changes happen. That's why we need to be current and up to date. I'm on page 114. And it's under the example. We talk about zoning amendment under the example on page 114. Are zoning changes done per city block? It depends. How do you determine which parcels are rezoned? You go to the zoning map. It all starts with the city, doing your research, being familiar with it, finding out the zoning for each property. Could it just be one property? Could it be a block? Could it be a neighborhood? Could it be a whole city, right? So you can go to the city page. We just looked at Winston-Salem, the GIS, all counties have a GIS. Google after class, your county GIS. Please don't do it now. I would consider that a distraction. Another zoning term is called an overlay district. And in an overlay district, one type of zoning is superimposed over another. So for example, some of you in the class may remember this thing. This was a projector before we had projectors. If you don't remember this, please don't tell me that. It just makes me feel old. So the way this happens is it used to be we took these transparent sheets and you laid it down on the glass here. And then the image projected and this brighter than bright light shot the image up into the screen. You guys remember this thing? Did you ever have teachers take two transparencies and put them on top of each other? That's what we mean by superimpose. That's what we're doing with an overlay district. So an example of an overlay district, you have two zoning areas on top of each other. You may have a residential zoning and a historic zoning area. And I'm going to talk about historic zoning next. So you have two zonings that you have to follow. You have to follow the residential zoning and you have to follow the historic because they're two on top of each other, overlay. Exactly like Old Salem. Old Salem is a historic district within the residential. Old Salem Historic District has to keep Old Salem looking like Old Salem. How does that differ from mixed? Because you got two on top of each other, two different types of zoning on top of each other. Again, historic and residential. Mixed use could be residential and commercial. You're allowed to do commercial and residential. Again, the best example of an overlay I think we're going to see is residential and historic. Maybe, maybe not. The only thing we need to worry about which one was there first was the non-conforming use. Trying to keep things simple here. Which came first? Non-conforming use. So our historic zoning, again, Old Salem, most towns have some kind of downtown historic section. The purpose is to preserve. We want to keep Old Salem looking like Old Salem. Did y'all know people actually live in Old Salem? You could buy a house. Have you ever had the opportunity to, next time you go to Old Salem, knock on somebody? No, do not knock on somebody's door. My teacher told me, no, y'all can't do that. But maybe once you get your license, you'll have the opportunity to show a house in Old Salem. And the exterior looks like Old Salem. But I'll tell you what, everything changes when you walk in that front door. The outside may look like the 1800s, but the inside looks like 2022. They are nice inside. Update. What the historic says, though, is before you make any changes to the exterior, we have to get approval through the Historic Preservation Zoning Board. They got to keep Old Salem looking like Old Salem. With historic zoning, if you get permission, if you get approval, and this is just an example, you guys don't need to worry about writing this down. You may get a certificate of appropriateness. And that certificate may say something like, no exterior portion of historic properties can be erected, altered, restored, moved, or demolished until after a certificate of appropriateness has been submitted to and approved by the Historic District Commission. So once you get approval to redo your siding, I mean, you got to tell them the material you're going to use, the color you're going to use. They got to make sure you're not going to have a pink house in Old Salem, because you know what wasn't around back in the days of Old Salem? Pink houses. So you got to get it approved. Aesthetic zoning is all about appearances. Appearance. We want to keep things looking pretty. There may be certain zoning for commercial. They can say you can build, you can bring your restaurant or your retail store, but it's got to be a certain color on the outside. It's got to be a certain construction material. Have you guys ever been to Biltmore Village up in Asheville? Biltmore Village looks like a Christmas scene, right? Straight from Christmas USA. There's aesthetic zoning up there. McDonald's doesn't look like the McDonald's that you and I see here in the Triad. McDonald's looks like it belongs in a Christmas town. That's their aesthetic zoning. Renota Village, there you go. There's another good one. Renota Village. Oak Ridge has to be brick. If that's true, is that an example? Yes. Why? Because they have restrictions on your exterior construction. Biltmore Village is the example I just gave, but we've given some other good examples. Biltmore Village. Homes along the Blue Ridge Parkway may have aesthetic zonings. We want to keep the Blue Ridge Parkway nice and pretty, don't we? So they may have aesthetic zoning, possibly the beach. Anything's possible, you guys. Could you have aesthetic zoning at the beach? Of course you can. Some aesthetic zoning will tell businesses how high their signs can be. So if you're driving around, I think Apex has a sign height restriction. If you're ever driving around Apex looking for McDonald's, don't look up for the golden arches. They have a sign height restriction. So all their signs are on the ground. I learned that one day when I was hangry and I couldn't find my McDonald's. Probably wasn't thinking clearly because I was hangry. I finally found it and it was all good. But I was looking up. I'm like, where are my golden arches? Spot zoning. With spot zoning, this is our last terminology. One or more properties is rezoned to permit a different use from the neighboring properties. So again, we're just taking one property, one section, one property, I need to say, and we're rezoning it. An example of this might be a neighborhood playground. We take that lot, we put in a playground. Spot zoning is legal only if it's in the public's best interest. If it's in the individual's best interest, then it's not legal. If it's in the individuals, you're probably looking more at a variance. Anything over 5,000, I'm not sure what you're asking there, Holly. Again, you guys, just some basic understandings. Okay, you need a permit for anything over $5,000. We'll talk about permits in just a second. Again, just have a basic understanding of these terms. Like I said, if you have a test question, it may give you a scenario and say, which type of zoning is this? So look this over, you know, after class, maybe consider making flashcards with the different zonings, or at least putting them on one piece of paper so you kind of have them right there together. So we talked about the terms. So let's talk about how this involves us. What do I care about as a broker when it comes to zoning? Well, first off, I have a duty to disclose zoning. As I just said, you can find zoning in the tax records, the city page, the county's GIS. As the listing agent, listing agents have to disclose the zoning. What is the property currently zoned for? Buyer's agents should be able to rely on that information. They should be able to rely on the information advertised, unless you have a reason for a flag to go up, unless you have a reason to question that zoning, or if your buyer has a very specific need, i.e., Julie, when I buy this house, I want to convert my garage into a hair salon. So we should be able to rely on the zoning advertised, unless we need to look into it further. So now back to the question. Do we deal with zoning when we're working with buyers in residential? Sure. And we need to just kind of be familiar here with urban versus rural areas. Basically, what I'm saying is urban is in town, rural is outside. So when you're working in urban areas, you're going to probably deal more with mixed use. Remember, we're just talking about downtown Winston-Salem. I mean, we got commercial, we got residential, we got historic, we got all sorts of things going on in downtown. You're dealing with more responsibilities. It requires more knowledge. You get out of Winston-Salem, you get into more rural areas. It's generally not as complex. So where the property be, again, though, you guys, please hear me when I say this, every single area is different. So just because you learn Winston-Salem zoning and you get very familiar with it, how is that going to help you in understanding Greensboro zoning? Is understanding Winston going to help you with Greensboro? Everybody shake your head no. Because just because you mastered Winston, that's all you've mastered. Everybody with me? Greensboro is different. So every area has its own zoning, has its own information. Listing agents, seller's agents, as we said, you always need to check a property before you list it. We're going to talk about something in Unit 8 called our multiple listing services, or the MLS. We'll talk about it in Unit 8. In the Triad MLS, zoning is a required field, which means I can't activate a listing without first having the zoning. And as the listing agent, I am responsible for making sure that that zoning that I'm advertising is correct. We're getting ready to learn as we go a little bit further. When you're listing a property, most of your work is done before you and I ever see it on the website for sale. There's a lot of research. There's a lot of information that we have to find to list the property, taking pictures and measuring and finding a price and looking up zoning and some of these other things we're going to talk about. By the time it goes for sale on the website and you and I see it, there's been a whole lot of work already done. And this is why I like this unit, because we're starting to talk about us as the broker. So the seller's agent needs to check zoning. It's a required field, at least in the Triad MLS. I cannot speak for other MLSs. The buyer's agent should be able to rely on what's listed, unless, of course, you have a flag that goes up, or if your buyer has a particular need. I operate by a pretty simple philosophy when I'm working with buyers and sellers, but particularly when I'm working with buyers. And my simple philosophy says, if it's important to my buyer, then it's important to me. So when my buyer says, I want to convert my garage into a hair salon, is that now important information to me? You better believe it is. It is my responsibility to make sure their end use is allowable. So let's look at an example together. An owner listed a vacant building previously used as a computer repair shop with a broker. Prospective buyer asked the broker if a manufacturing company could operate in the building. Without investigating, the broker said, sure. The buyer makes an offer, seller accepted, and a contract was formed. Luckily, prior to closing, the buyer discovered the zoning was commercial, the zoning class that excluded manufacturing use. Couple things went wrong here, didn't it? First off, well, we don't know what the listing agent listed the zoning as. We don't know that. A prospective buyer asked the broker if a manufacturer could operate, and the broker, without investigating, said yes. Do we see where the broker went wrong? Once that buyer asked, what should that broker have done? Looked it up, checked it out, right? Why? Because if it's important to my buyer, then it's important to me. Y'all don't answer questions just for the sake of answering them. If you don't know the answer, you guys, a perfectly valid answer is, I don't know, let me get back to you. If you're asked a question and you don't know, it's okay to say, that's a good question, I'm not sure, let me get back to you. Don't just blurt an answer out. Questions on zoning. Another public land use control is subdivisions. Now, I'm not talking about the individual sub, I'm talking about creating and developing a subdivision. And the first thing we need to understand about creating and developing a subdivision is what the heck a subdivision is. You don't need to write this down. I'm on page 116. A little over halfway up, you guys see where it says in North Carolina? This is how we define a subdivision. The definition of a subdivision is all divisions of a tract or parcel of land into how many or more lots? 2 or more lots for the purpose of sale development, and includes a division of land involving the dedication of a new street or a change in existing streets. Maybe they have covenants, maybe they have an HOA, maybe they don't. This is all subdivisions. And one of the first things we need to understand about a subdivision, again, by the time you and I see the equipment out there clearing the land and starting to build the subdivision, there was a whole lot of work that went into it to get approval before they ever showed up and started doing the work. It's not like somebody wakes up one day and says, oh, I'm going to put a subdivision here. There's a whole lot that goes into it before you and I start seeing all those equipments. And part of what we have to do is get approval from the government and make sure it's in accordance with the master plan. Make sure it complies with that plan and where they see themselves in 20 years. Just to briefly mention, subdivisions, any division of land and a parcel of 10 or more acres or no street right of way does not fall under the classification of subdivision. It's an exemption. Or a division of land no more than 2 acres and no more than 3 lots with no street right of way, again, wouldn't fall under the category of a subdivision. I would not get bogged down on this. This is just more FYI. Not every single tract of land is considered a subdivision. The basic definition of a subdivision says you take a lot, you divide it into 2 or more lots, and you have a street. That's what I need you guys to focus on. Are y'all's hands hurting? Cramping up a little bit? Y'all are writing a lot. As I mentioned earlier, subdivisions, the development has to comply with the overall master plan. The developer has to go to the government. They have to go to the zoning board and get approval. Again, whole lots of work that goes into it before you and I ever see that equipment. Subdivisions usually generally have a plat map. We briefly mentioned the plat map back in Unit 4. We have to have the final plat map before the first unit is sold. That's worth me saying again. We have to have the final plat map, and these are usually recorded before the developer can sell the first unit, before they can sell the first tract of land. We can go under contract with a preliminary, but you can't have your first closing in that subdivision until the plat map is finalized. Doesn't a buyer deserve to know what they're buying? Let's think this through. You guys are consumers. You're out buying products every single day, right? Don't you deserve to know what you're buying? And if you're buying a house in a subdivision, don't you deserve to know what that final plat map's going to look like? Could you imagine buying a house and then they say, oh, we're going to change this? Well, I'm stuck. I kind of bought it now, right? So we need everything finalized, the plat map finalized before we can sell the first unit. If we go under contract with a preliminary and that preliminary is changed, the buyer may have an option, usually should have an option to rescind their contract if they're not happy with the change, because that's not what they contracted with. You guys with me? If anything changes from what they contracted with. The developers have their own set of rules and regulations, Again, I know we're not in developer school, but I do think it's handy for us to kind of understand what their rules and regulations are. We're constantly on the lookout for those little red flags that goes up, tells us that something may not be right. So for the developers, it's illegal to sell land prior to recording the final plat map. As the buyer's agent, when your buyer asks you if you can buy in this subdivision and you find out we don't have the final plat map yet, you're going to have a flag go up? Yeah, we're now going to make sure that before my buyer closes, before that first unit is sold, we have the final, right? And if your buyer thinks they're going to close on a preliminary, don't we need to get in front of the developer and ask some questions? That's why we're going over this stuff. So they cannot, is illegal to sell, to close on the first tract of land before we have that final plat map. Again, we can have preliminary, we can go under contract with preliminary, but it's got to be recorded before that closing. My real estate firm, we work with a couple different builders, and one of them in particular, I remember when we started the subdivision back in 2018, I think, and we had preliminary stuff while we were still clearing the land. We weren't selling lots yet, but we had preliminary stuff. How do I know we had preliminary stuff? Because every single thing that we had to provide to buyers had a big purple preliminary written across it. Anybody that got their hands on this stuff knew that it wasn't the final, that we were still working out the kinks, still trying to finalize that. Once we got it finalized, the preliminary went away. We only looked at the final going forward. We have to have the final before we can close on the first unit. Any questions on that? Everybody hearing what I'm saying? And why this is important to me as a broker? On page 117, it kind of goes into the subdivision process. Remember earlier, I just said there's a whole lot that goes into the planning before you and I ever start seeing that equipment at a subdivision. You and I don't see this equipment until step 3. So first you got your preliminary stage, step 1, your preliminary stage, finding the land. We got to find suitable land, making sure it's suitable. Can we do public water and sewer, or do we have to have community or private? We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a bit. Approval from the zoning board if we're going to make any changes. Then we move on to phase 2 is the final planning stage. We're finalizing all the preliminary, the plans, the plat maps. What designs are we going to use to build the houses? That a lot of that may be based on what kind of land we're dealing with. What's our topography? How much do we have to clear? How many trees do we have to cut down? And then stage 3 is usually where you and I see them. That's when the big equipment starts showing up. That's when they start clearing the land, getting it ready to build. Whole lot of work goes into it before you and I ever see it. Okay, how we doing? Everybody hanging in there with me? Okay, thumbs up, good. Let's go ahead and take our last break. So let's take 10. We come back, we keep going in unit 7. Nope, 6. All right. How we doing? We're doing good. One more hour today. You hanging in there with me? Of course, right before we leave today, we're going to talk about what Thursday looks like. We start getting into the good stuff on Thursday. So we'll talk about what that's going to look like, what our next couple weeks are going to look like right before we leave today. So let me take attendance. Okay. Will, you came on right when I was, but I got you. So you're all set. Okay. With subdivisions and subdivision planning, the developer also has to plan streets. We have something called the North Carolina Subdivision Street Disclosure Law. The developer has to dedicate the streets in the subdivision as public or private. With subdivision street disclosure law, public or private, this has nothing to do whether or not you can drive down the street or not. Nothing to do with that. What this is referring to, public or private, is who maintains it. If the street is dedicated as public, then the hope is that NCDOT is going to maintain it. They're going to take DOT, being the Department of Transportation, and they're going to take on that responsibility. If the streets are dedicated as private, that means the homeowners that live on that street are responsible for maintenance. It might be dues, might be rolled into their HOAs. They may do a special assessment. If we get a pothole, we may need to do a special assessment, or when you repave the streets, etc. All streets are dedicated. They're dedicated either as private or public. Here's the key. This is the catch. DOT is not going to accept responsibility until the streets in that subdivision are complete. So you start, you clear the land, you pave way for the streets on the dirt. The developer brings in the concrete guys and they lay the first layer of concrete down. So we can get our big, heavy equipment up and down the streets to build the houses, right? We need big equipment to build houses. Have you guys ever driven through a subdivision being built and there's like a gap at the curb or a gap on the sidewalk? Or maybe you even have a raised manhole cover, for example. What we're looking at there is the first layer of concrete, the first layer of road. Once all the homes in that subdivision or that phase are complete, and all of that big, heavy equipment is out of the subdivision, then the developer puts down the final layer of concrete. And that's when DOT comes in and agrees to or not accept the responsibility. Just because a street is dedicated as public is no guarantee that DOT is going to accept the responsibility for maintenance. Streets have to be built in a very particular way. DOT is very particular about their streets and how they want them built, how they want them constructed. So before DOT will accept them, they need to come back through that final layer and make sure they were constructed. And yes, DOT does check in to make sure that their streets are being constructed according to their standards. Failure to build the street to DOT standards means that they're not going to accept maintenance. So if DOT isn't going to do it, then who is? The homeowners. This is one of these things we had to learn the hard way. There were subdivisions built in the 80s and the 90s, even early 2000s. And purchasers, potential homeowners were told that DOT was going to take on the responsibility. The reason that they were told that is because they were dedicated as public. But then the subdivision got complete. DOT came in to accept them and they said, not built to our standards, we're not going to accept them. So now fast forward 20, 30 years, and these streets are in need of repair. These people bought thinking DOT is going to take care of them. They're on the phone, they're sending emails, they're like, DOT, why don't you come fix the street? And DOT saying, hey, we never accepted responsibility. Because of mistakes that we've made in the past, this is one of these things that is a lot more important now that we understand than what it was 20, 30 years ago. So let's talk about in practice. You're licensed, you're helping a buyer purchase a home in a new subdivision. You get the information from the developer, you guys are looking through it together, and you look at your buyer and you say, the streets are dedicated as public, which means the developer hopes, fingers crossed, that DOT takes on responsibility. But I have no guarantee. There are no promises. It's not until all of that equipment is out, that final layer of concrete is laid, then DOT comes in and decides whether or not they're going to accept them. Do not look at buyers and guarantee them that they're going to be expected, not unless you just want to try to speak on behalf of DOT. You're probably going to face some kind of consequences for that. Dedicated versus accepted. Understand, every single street is dedicated to DOT. It's dedicated as either private or public. Whether or not DOT maintains it when it's finished is whether or not they accept it. I'll try to remember to show you, but in case I don't, let me mention now. In Learn, Test, Pass, I have a Q&A brochure on subdivisions and streets. And the Q&A brochure, it's in the Unit 6 material. And the Q&A brochure was written to the buyer. But I think some of these Q&A brochures help us better wrap our brains around this information. So y'all make yourselves a note to look at the subdivision and streets Q&A. I say brochure, it's a flat PDF that's in Learn, Test, Pass in the Unit 7 material. Everything you've ever wanted to know about streets is pages 118 over to page 120. You guys see all those italicized words? That's the actual law. If you want to sit down and read the law, there you go. And I hope you guys are starting to get your groove into looking ahead. Are you guys able to keep up with that, please? Those of you that have been able to look ahead, keep up with that. Because again, Thursday, we start getting into the really good stuff. But one thing I like about the units, y'all pay attention to the examples and especially pay attention to the in practice. The in practice is like the real world scenario. So why is this important in pre-licensing? Because it is. So we talk about dedicated versus accepted. I don't have it right here in front of me, but it's probably on page 117 and 120. Under subdivision street disclosure law. If I'm talking about it in class, it's a good candidate for your exam. And do you think it's important in practice when you're working with buyers? So both, right? A testable point and in practice. You don't need to know the law. No, you don't need to know the law. That's why I said read it if you want. Okay. Another act that we have is the Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure Act. This applies to subdivisions when you're marketing, advertising across state lines. That's what we mean by interstate. We're going across state lines. And when you're advertising or marketing across state lines, you got to provide certain information to the prospective purchaser. Internet's changed some things, hasn't it? How many of you, where are you guys? How many of you on this call remember life before the internet? Life before the internet. That was good times, wasn't it? Back in the good old days. Internet's changed things. It used to be, when this act came to be, it used to be that before the internet, we actually had to go across state lines to market. We had to go across state lines to advertise. Today, all of our advertising goes across state lines, doesn't it? Because we put it online, and who has access to it? The world. So all of our advertising goes across state lines today. There was the story, I don't know if it's true or not, but it's the story about the shady salesman that drove up to like Michigan back in the 60s, maybe the 50s or the 60s, and drove up to Michigan in the dead of winter. And he went knocking on doors trying to sell sunny or land in sunny Florida. You know how cold you are right now? You could be warmer if you moved to Florida. And so these lots were being sold. People, where do I sign? This sounds good. I'm cold. I want to be warm. I want to go to Florida. Where do I sign? Spring thaw rolled around, packed up the family car, and drove from Michigan to Florida just to find swampland that you couldn't build on. That was the kind of reason why the Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure Act came to be. We're trying to protect those people across state lines that aren't aware. Now we have the luxury. While you're standing on my front porch trying to sell me this land, I could, go to Google and check it out and see it for myself, right? So things have changed for sure. Internet's changed that, but the act still applies. Still talking about building or public land use controls. Another public land use control we have is building codes. Building codes are statewide. Building codes are statewide. Building codes set the minimum acceptable level of construction, with their main focus being on safety. There are minimum standards that builders and developers have to follow. Can they do above and beyond the minimum? Of course they can. But building codes set the floor. One way that we enforce zoning is by requiring building permits. And I'll tell you what a CO is in just one second. A permit is asking permission to build or do major renovations. If you're doing major changes to a property, you need to go to your local zoning board and request a permit. And upon issuance of that permit, you've been given permission to build or do that renovation. Once the work is complete, then the city will issue a certificate of occupancy or a CO. A certificate of occupancy closes out a permit. A CO says this has been constructed according to building code standards. Permits are permission. COs close a permit out. I've always heard certificate of occupancy. It doesn't say it's safe to occupy. It says that it's in compliance. It says that it's closed out the permits It did everything according to our building code standards. If you're building a house, the city is coming out periodically and checking on the progress to make sure that it follows the building code standards. Let's say, for example, we just built this house. We just built it. And we didn't have, maybe I just built this room. Maybe I just added a room to the back of the house, or maybe I built the whole house. And nobody came out and checked on the progress throughout the process. And they show up at the end, and I got my sheetrock up. I got my wall up. I don't know if there is or not, but let's just pretend there's electrical behind this wall. How do we know if this electrical was installed correctly? How do we know if this was good? At this point, because I already have a wall, the only way to tell is to bust into the wall and look, right? Please don't tear down my wall. If you come in as the progress, once you do electrical, then you have somebody come in and check the progress. Once you do the plumbing, once you do the various stages of construction, then you can gauge the process and make sure that the whole thing is being done according to these building codes. I've always heard that anytime when it comes to renovations, anytime you're messing with electrical, plumbing, or structural, you need a permit. Electrical, you're not going to be tested on this, but I always get a cajillion questions on it. Electrical, plumbing, or structural. So if you're adding a room to the back of the house and you're messing with electrical, plumbing, or structural, if you're finishing the unfinished basement, you're probably messing with at least electrical, if not plumbing and structural. You guys with me? I've always heard when you're messing with those three things you need. So before you guys start typing in the chat, do I need a permit to do this? Does it mess with electrical, plumbing, or structural? Let's say you build the room on the back of your house, or you finish the unfinished basements and you didn't get permits pulled. Maybe you didn't know that you needed to have permits pulled to finish your unfinished basement. That space would be an unpermitted space. Unpermitted space. It's completed, but it didn't have the permits pulled. The fact that it's unpermitted space is a material fact. A material fact is something that I have to disclose. We are going to talk all about material facts in Unit 7. So unpermitted space. I'm getting questions. I guess I shouldn't, I apologize. Electrical, plumbing, or structural within the main dwelling. If you got like a shed or something, you probably wouldn't need permits for that. I'm talking about that affect the main dwelling. Thank you. And that's right, cost doesn't matter. Electrical, plumbing, or structural. So let's say, well, let me give you guys an example. I got called, gosh, it's been a couple years now. One of my acquaintances wanted to sell her house. So she called me and said, can you come out and talk to me about listing my house? And I said, of course I can. I knew her when she bought that house. I was around when she bought it. I showed up for the housewarming party. You know, I saw the house however many years ago when she purchased it. Now she's wanting to sell it. Before I went to my listing appointment with her, I did some research on the house. We'll talk about that as we go. But I looked up, you know, the zoning, the tax record, NCDOT. Are there any proposed highways, construction around? We'll talk about those in just a second. But when I pulled the tax record, and from what I remember when she purchased it, she bought a 3-bedroom, 1-bath house. I was there. I saw it. I pulled the tax records. You know what the tax record said? 3-bed, 1-bath. I showed up for the listing appointment and I saw a 3-bedroom house, but it had 2 bathrooms. And I said, huh, where'd that other bathroom come from? Tax records say 1. I remember just 1. Where did that second bathroom? She said, well, we took, you know, part of this room and part of that closet and part of this room, and we tore down the walls and messed with electrical and plumbing. She didn't say that, but you guys get the gist, right? And we created our own bathroom. We created a second bathroom. And then I asked her, knowing the answer to this question, did you pull permits? I knew she didn't. Why? Because the tax record still said 1 bathroom. So she finished this bathroom unpermitted. She didn't have permits pulled. So I explained to her, I can list this property and I can call it a 3-bed, 2-bath. I can call it a 3-bed, 2-bath, but I have to disclose that that second bathroom was unpermitted space. I have to disclose that. Part of the reason for that being, one, the tax department doesn't know about that. Does the tax department want to know that there's 2 bathrooms? Are they going to make more money? Yeah. But the second part about, let's talk about briefly about homeowners insurance. Unpermitted space may not be covered by homeowners insurance. Again, what if you put the electrical in that bathroom, you watched a YouTube video or checked a book out from the library and said how hard this can be? I can do the electrical work. And you went and did it. Do we know if you did it right? I don't know. But what if one day the house burns down and the fire department sources the start of the fire back to that unpermitted bathroom? Is your homeowner's insurance going to cover you? Probably not. What are they going to say? Well, had you had this space permitted, the electrical would have been done right and the house wouldn't have burned down. So why is unpermitted space important when somebody's buying a house? They may not be covered. They may not be covered under homeowners insurance. I'll be honest with you, I never got that listing. We thanked each other. It was so good to see you. We need to do lunch one day. I knew she was talking to other agents. She did tell me that. Competitive listing appointments are very real. We'll talk more about that. I hate, for whatever reason, I hate losing a listing. I hate it for whatever reason. And I will stalk a listing if I lose it, because I want to know who gets it and for how much. It's a small world, the broker community, very small world. So I want to know who got this property listed and for how much. This property never did get listed. She went for sale by owner. Did she do it because of the unpermitted bathroom? My gut says yes, because probably every agent that showed up said the same thing that I did. Somebody came in, can that be rectified? You could have the county, and I suggested this to her and she kind of rolled her eyes at me. You can have the county come in and inspect space after the fact, but it's still not going to be as good. Because what's the only way to know about the electrical behind this wall? To tear the wall down. So they may come in and look at it and do some tests. So can it be rectified? Yes. Is it going to cost money? Of course it is. But it's still not as good coming in after the fact as what it is as it's being built before this wall goes up. Additions would be evident in the tax record. Should be. Does it affect value if a flipper flips a house and they didn't pull the permits? Boy, I as a buyer would have flags go up. If I had a flipped house or even a new construction, I sure would as a buyer. Maybe that's me knowing what I know. I would tell my buyers to have a flag go up if an inspector. There's an instructor. I'll tell you guys another story real quick. There's another instructor with Carolina School of Real Estate. And she was having some work done in her house. I don't remember what she was doing, but they were doing some major renovations. And she interviewed 3 contractors. You know, she wanted to get price comparison, right? So she interviewed 3 contractors and she asked all 3 of them, do you pull permits? And you know what the cheapest guy said? No, I don't mess with permits. Well, he didn't know she was a real estate agent. He didn't know she taught this stuff. But the general contractor looked at her and said, no, I don't mess with that. I don't do that. Do you think he got that job? No, because she wanted, so somebody said in the chat, do it right the first time. Do you need a permit to build a porch? That's a good answer. I don't know a good question, I should say. I don't know the answer to that. Does this only pertain to the main structure of the property? That's to my understanding. My understanding, it would be the main structure, attached garage. Again, it can't hurt to call the county and say, I'm doing a detached garage with electrical. Do I need permits? Right? When in doubt, find out. So if this is your project, somebody says anything electrical, whether it's the main structure or not, I'm going to talk about that $30,000 in just 1 second. Hang on to that just for 1 second. So unpermitted space is a material fact, which means I can advertise it, I can promote it, I can tell you square footage and 2 bedrooms, but I have to disclose that that space wasn't permitted. Okay, again, we'll learn all about material facts in Unit 7. So hang on to that. We'll see it. A couple cameras have just kicked off. There you go. Thank you. A couple other ones. That was good timing. A couple other ones. So please make sure your camera's on. Okay, so side-by-side comparison. Building codes are construction standards for safety. Zoning regulations are local laws that regulate land use. Building codes are enforced by zoning. How do you get these permits? You go to the zoning board, you go to the city and you request the permits. And they're the ones that are going to make sure that the construction was built according to the minimum construction standards for safety. And actually, the question came in about the $30,000. That isn't about permits. I just thought about that. That's our mechanics law. Remember mechanics lien back in Unit 2, I think, or 3. That $30,000 is when the renovation cost of when you need a contractor, a lien agent. City or county, that's right, it just depends. Maybe you call the city, maybe you call the county, it just depends. All counties and cities are different. Okay, so building codes give us our minimum safety standards. Zoning regulates land use. The two work together. You want permission to build, you're going to have to do it according to the statewide building codes. Okay, we good? So let's switch gears just a bit. Still talking about some public land use controls, but let's switch gears just a bit and talk about kind of a crappy topic. We need to talk about on-site septic systems. Y'all see what I did there? On-site septic systems. We got to talk about them. If the property cannot hook up to public sewer, it's got to go somewhere, right? So if it cannot hook up to public sewer, then the property will have to have an on-site septic system. On-site septic system permits come from the county health department, the county in which the property is located. Permits tell the owner of that property various uses and capacity limit. So first off, let's start back at the beginning. You have raw land and you buy land because you want to build on it. One thing that'll have to be done is determine where all the water of your house is going to go. We're not just necessarily talking about septic. We're talking about washing machine, dishwasher, shower, kitchen sink, bathroom sink, right? Like all the water of your house has to go somewhere. And it runs through the septic system. If the raw land can't be hooked up to public sewer, then you're going to have somebody come in and do a soil suitability test, also known as a PERC test, P-E-R-C. We want to know if the land perks. Can it support an on-site septic system? Once we learn that, then we decide if we can build a house here or not. We can't hook up to public sewer. Not all land will support an on-site septic system. So that should be one of the early things that we need to do. And again, that permit from the county is going to tell us if there's any limitations or things that can overload the system. For example, a garbage disposal may overload the system. You may be limited on where it is or various uses. The permit will also tell you the capacity limit, and it states the capacity limit and a number of bedrooms. And the general rule of thumb is to have 2 human heartbeats per bedroom. We're not talking about your 4-legged friends. 2 human heartbeats per bedroom. So for example, if the permit states that the septic system capacity is for a 3-bedroom house, how many people will that support? That'll support 6 people. If you have more than 6 living there, you could overload it. You may have to have it drained or tended to more often, right? Because the system is telling, again, you guys, this is all water, dishwasher, washing machine, everything. When you're getting ready to list a home for sale, you get called on a listing appointment, yay, you find out that it's on an on-site septic system. You ask the homeowner, do you have your permit, your septic permit? If they say no, you say, well, let's get on the phone with the county health department and get that process started. Because you know what a good buyer's agent is going to ask for? The septic permit. So before you list, you want to make sure you have it, or at least get that process started. But in this case, the seller says, yeah, we got our septic permit. Here it is right here. And you look at the septic permit and you see the capacity is 3 bedrooms. Even if you have a 4th room that would make for a perfectly good bedroom, we can only advertise the number of bedrooms as allowed per the septic permit. So if you have what you think is a 4-bedroom house, the permit says 3, what does your listing say? Your listing tells you you have a 3-bedroom a 3-bedroom property. There's been many a times that I've been with buyers looking at property, and we're standing in what could be a perfectly good 4th bedroom. No reason why we couldn't look at the 4th bedroom, but the MLS says 3 bedrooms with an office or 3 bedrooms with a bonus. Why is that? Because the septic permit only allows for 3. Again, this is one of these things that's coming back to bite us in the butt. 20, 30 years ago, we listed as 4-bedroom because that's what the homeowner said. And now we're running into a situation where that's not, it's coming back to bite us. One of my teammates went on a listing appointment last year, and he was talking to the sellers, and he looked at the permit. He said, we can only advertise a 3-bedroom, and the sellers were livid. And I can't blame them. They were like, we bought a 4-bedroom and you're telling me now we have to sell a 3-bedroom? That's correct, because what does the permit say? We can only advertise the number of bedrooms as allowed per the permit on an on-site septic. You guys understand, if it's public, you can advertise 17 bedrooms if you want to, right? Don't do that, but you're with me, right? You can advertise, there's no limit if it's a public sewer. So we as brokers are expected to verify the number of bedrooms that are allowed per the permit. Ask the seller, do you have your permit? If they say no, have them get on the phone with the health department, have them get that process started. We haven't talked yet about disciplinary action from the North Carolina Real Estate Commission, but we will in Unit 7. And if we misrepresent the number of bedrooms in our advertising, we could be subject to disciplinary action from the North Carolina Real Estate Commission. Again, we'll talk more about that when we get into Unit 7. Questions on that? Two human heartbeats per bedroom. There is something else called straight piping. in which the water goes directly from the property into a nearby creek or stream. I think the most common example that we see this is maybe the water from a washing machine. Straight piping is not illegal. If we see that, we have to disclose it. It is a material fact. Again, talking all about material facts in Unit 7. Another thing regulated by public land use controls is whether or not the property is in a flood hazard. Areas in a flood hazard are designated by FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency. We're going to talk about flood insurance when we get to Unit 13. Unit 13 is property insurance, so we'll talk about flood insurance then. Flood insurance is not cheap, by the way. Flood insurance is not cheap at all. And if your property is near a body of water, creek, stream, pond, lake, river, anything that could flood, you may have to pay for flood insurance. If an area is in a flood hazard, how we use the land may be restricted. The location of the structures, the types of structures, for example, elevation, how high up off the ground is it? So the land may be restricted in how we can use the property. Best way to identify a flood hazard is to have a survey done. A survey will tell you if it's in a flood hazard or not. Maybe log out and log back in. Another thing with public land use controls that we need to be aware about, and this one's a pretty big one in practice, is highways nearby. We need to disclose any planned construction. Again, by the time we see the equipment out there, construction has already started. So the best way to find out if there's any planned construction is to go to NCDOT's website. Google North Carolina Department of Transportation. Please don't do it now, wait till after class. But we need to make sure we're checking this site when we're getting ready to list a property, for example. This is part of our research going into it. If there's planned construction, if there are planned roads, that's a material fact that we have to disclose. I had a listing once. Where are my Kernersville people? My Kernersville people can tell you all about that dang beltway. How long have they been planning that thing? I mean, how many years have they been talking about that beltway? When I moved to the Triad in 2000, they were talking about it. Who knows how long prior to that? Again, you guys, people just don't wake up one day and say, oh, let's put a beltway here. It takes time, sometimes years and years and years and years to plan. So I had a listing that butted up to 421, now known as Salem Parkway. And it's right there around that belt loop, where that loop is now. And eventually there will be an entrance or an exit ramp to Salem Parkway. It's still not there. I had this listing back in 2014, 2015, something like that, and it's still not there, but it's planned. So even though it's still not there, I still had to disclose. I had to disclose to potential purchasers, there will be a ramp right here one day. Every agent that called me on behalf of their buyer with questions about the property, I said, by the way, did you know about the planned ramp? I had a map in my listing that had an arrow pointing to it, talking about you are here. So you could actually see the proximity. That's what I had to disclose. I didn't have to disclose the fact that 421 was right there, Business 40 was right there, whatever. You could walk out in the back porch and see it. What I had to disclose was the planned, what's the yet to come. Again, how do we find this out? NCDOT. We're doing a lot of research before we actually list the property. I had all this information. Another thing just to mention briefly, when you go down, where are my people down east? You lucky ducks. You may run into some wetlands. I think we see this the further east that we go. With the wetland, the groundwater is at or near the surface, so it's prone to flooding. If it doesn't stay wet all the time, it doesn't take much to flood it. Very rarely can you build on wetlands. These are usually protected areas. And they got all sorts of controls and regulations, federal, state, local. Questions on our public land use control. Why don't you guys remind me in the chat, who enforces public land use control? Who enforces public land use controls? Yep. Had it right the first time. Who enforces public land use controls? The government, the police powers. If you see somebody violating zoning, call the cops. If you see somebody violating public land use controls, you call the cops. They're the ones that enforce it. Do I have everybody? So what if your neighbor illegally opens a garage or opens a hair salon out of their garage? Yeah, call the cops. Public land use controls. So let's switch gears just a bit and talk about private land use controls. Private land use controls are our HOAs, our homeowners associations. And most HOAs have some kind of covenant. You can hear them that all this means the same thing. Restrictive covenant is the same thing as protective covenant, is the same thing as your CC&R. It's the restriction, it's the control, the covenant. And what these private land use controls tell us in an HOA is certain things that you may or may not be able to do on your property because you're in this HOA. Violation of a private land use control, do not call the cops. But if your neighbor is violating private land use controls, if they are violating covenants, the cops can't help you, don't call them. Call the HOA. Contact your HOA. Covenants are appurtenant, which means they do what? They run with the land. Thank you for that. That's my good laugh today. Thank you. They run with the land, which means the first owner in a subdivision abides by the covenants, the second owner, the third owner, the 400th owner. You guys with me? Once the developer sets up the covenants, they are there to stay. Can they be changed? Possibly. How are they changed? It depends. Maybe the HOA can vote to change it if they want. Maybe we got to go stand in front of a judge, who knows? But generally speaking, when the developer creates an HOA, a subdivision with an HOA, and they impose these covenants, for the most part, they are here to stay. I've learned in my years, you can pretty much take the population and put them in two different categories. People that don't mind an HOA and people that absolutely refuse to live in an HOA. Some people say, I won't be restricted. Other people will say, I don't want my neighbor to have 10 cars on cinder blocks in the front yard. Usually an HOA isn't going to allow that. I'm also pretty sure I could take this call and I could divide this call into two categories. When I turned this screen, there were those of you that went, ew, look at that house. And then there were the rest of us that went, ooh, look at that house. How you feel about this house being next door to you for across the street for you may depend on whether or not you want to be in an HOA. You are going to be hard to have a hot pink house, a Pepto-Bismol house in an HOA. You guys with me? So if this doesn't bother you, maybe consider not getting in an HOA. If this just turned your skin and made you cringe a little bit, maybe consider an HOA because you don't have to worry about it. Is this real? Yeah, I don't know where it was, but heck yeah. You see the car driving by? I borrowed it from Facebook, so I don't have a source for it. You know all those memes, aren't they a good time? Okay. So with private land use controls, typical matters addressed, we're trying to provisions that require regular property maintenance. All covenants, all restrictions are different. All HOAs are different. Some may have restrictions on parking or fencing or architectural details. Some may tell you there's only 2 shades of blue you can paint your front door. Some will tell you that your front grass can only not get any higher than, you know, X amount. And then you got the people that need to find a volunteer job somewhere because they're actually going around in people's front yards with a yardstick and making sure that their grass isn't too high. If so, they're going to call the HOA and tell on you. They're all a little bit different. And I think it's important that we understand the reason that they're established to begin with is to maintain standards, to maintain certain standards. If you are with buyers and you're showing property in an HOA and you look out in the backyard, and let's say, for example, your buyer says, I was going to ask you if we could put a fence up, but I see that guy over there has a fence, so I'm sure it's okay. What's the only thing we know by looking at a fence or a storage building? Somebody put a fence there. Just because you see a fence in an HOA doesn't mean the covenants allow it. Y'all don't know. The HOA could be in the throes of the legal battle with that homeowner. They could be fining them X amount per day that the fence is there. So just because you see somebody else with a fence in an HOA does not mean that the HOA allows the fence. The only thing you know by looking at a fence, hey, somebody put a fence there. So you can help your buyers get their hands on the covenants so they can verify that they can put a fence up. If my buyer tells me they want to put a fence up, isn't that important to me? Everybody shake your head yes. Why? Because if it's important to my buyer, then it's important to me. So if my buyer wants a fence, I'm going to help them make sure that a fence is allowed. So as we said, our private land use controls are imposed by the developer when they create the subdivision. They're enforced by an owners association. So maybe that owners association is managed by a property management company. Maybe they're managed by individual property owners. Sometimes you may have an HOA where all property owners like take turns. They switch out who gets to be president and vice president, treasurer and secretary, and they kind of rotate through. As we said, they're appurtenant, which means they run with the land. Covenants cannot be for anything that is illegal. Now, I'm certainly not suggesting that they were created for an illegal purpose, but laws and rules change over time. Yes. For example, you might have covenants from the 30s. Maybe a subdivision was built in the 30s or 40s. And when the covenants were developed back in the 30s and 40s, one of the restrictions might have been that a certain class of people, is not allowed to live in this HOA. Today, thanks to fair housing, we cannot discriminate against various classes of people. So while back in the 40s, it might not have been illegal, today it is, and it can't be enforced. I got a whole unit dedicated to fair housing. We're going to spend all of entire Unit 19 talking about who the protected classes are and how we protect the protected classes. Covenants are recorded. That's one of those things that Connor tells us that we have to record. So covenants are recorded. Again, you guys, we can help our buyers get the information. Please remember, we are fact finders, which means I help them get the information. I cannot interpret documents. So when my buyer says, what does this mean? I either need to get them to the HOA or get them to an attorney. I help them get the information. I'm a fact finder. Private land use controls are covenants that are regulated, enforced by the HOA. So again, back to your buyer that wants to convert the garage into a hair salon. Oh, but this time they're looking at properties in an HOA. Now I have a duty to check with zoning to make sure it's allowed. And I have a duty to check with the covenants to make sure it's allowed. You guys with me? Because now we got to make sure that both are allowed. Sometimes there's conflicting information between zoning and covenants. And what that conflicting information, anytime you have conflicting information between laws or rules, the more restrictive of the two will prevail, whichever one is more strict. I will do that at 1 o'clock. An example, that's just making me hungry. An example of a recorded covenant, again, it's going to tell you, for example, can you have a fence? Is there a certain color you can paint the front door? How high can the grass be? Does your mailbox have to look a certain ways? Those could all, you can't have cars and cinder blocks on the front yard. Those are all examples of things that we may see in covenants. They're restrictions on how you can use the land. Okay. All right, let's bring this home. What's the broker's responsibility when it comes to this unit? Why are we here talking about this unit? Well, as I've been saying, there's a whole lot of work that goes into a property before we list it. Part of that work that goes into the property before we list it is to review the zoning, review the covenants, review the land use controls before we list a property or before we assist our buyer in writing an offer on the property. As the buyer's agent, I have a duty to make sure that the consumer's end use will be allowed. Can they convert that garage into a hair salon? Can they have a home daycare out of their home? Do zoning and covenants allow for that? And as we said, it's not my job to interpret. It's my job to help them find the information. If they have major questions, get them to their attorney. The attorney can interpret legal documents. If you're not an attorney, then you can't interpret legal documents. And we need to advise. We need to advise our consumers if any ordinance or covenants could affect their use and enjoyment of the property. Let them know. Here's the zoning. This is its restriction. Here's its restrictive covenants. I know you need a fence. You're not allowed to have a fence. I know you need to park your RV in the driveway. You cannot do it in this subdivision. And they're all different. So just because you can't park your RV in the driveway in this subdivision, could you park it in the next subdivision? I don't know. We got to get our hands on those covenants, right? So we're going to advise if it could affect their use, again, especially if they share something of importance. We're going to advise consumer if the property is subject to an owners association. So is it in an HOA? We're going to let them know the cost. HOAs come with dues. Are they monthly? Are they quarterly? Are they annually? Again, that's information that the listing agent generally supplies. But if there's any questions or red flags, help your buyer verify. Hopefully we are letting our buyers know, particularly our buyers, helping them getting their hands on those covenants and other documents prior to making an offer, especially if they have a specific use or particular use. A lot of times the listing agent will include covenants in the listing. Again, we're going to talk about our multiple listing services in Unit 8. But in the Triad MLS, I have the ability, I can upload attachments for other agents to see. So I could just put the covenants in. I like to make my listings easy to sell. So I always put my covenants in so buyers agents can see that. They don't have to do the research. That's just me though. You're not going to be tested on that. And that's just my personal feelings on it. But I like to make my listings easy to sell. Either way, we need to help them get their hands on that information. Ideally, before we present the offer. Sometimes you get swiftly moving markets where that may not be possible. So we're going to help them get that information as soon as we can. If there are any questions about the covenants or the owners association, we need to have them call that HOA or their attorney. Again, I cannot interpret it. So it is 1 o'clock. Goodness, Julie, stop talking. So we're going to end here today to answer the earlier question, quarter pounder with cheese. So with that being said, let's go get some lunch. I want some lunch now, right? Thursday, we're going to finish Unit 6. We're very close. We're going to do Unit 20. And then we get into Unit 7. Unit 7 is when the good stuff starts. So please, please, please look ahead. So that's what Thursday looks like. It's 1:01. Thank you guys. Have a good afternoon. And I will see everybody Thursday.